The Mandela Effect represents a curious phenomenon where large groups of people share the same false memory of an event, a product, a phrase, or a piece of popular culture, and they remain convinced of the accuracy of their recollection despite evidence to the contrary existing all around them. The term itself originates from the case of Nelson Mandela, the former South African president, when many people distinctly remembered that he had died in prison during the 1980s. Yet historical records clearly show that he was released in 1990 and lived until 2013, passing away at his home after a prolonged illness. The phenomenon gained widespread attention and acquired its name when Fiona Broome, a paranormal researcher, discovered that she and many others shared this identical false memory about Mandela's death. And rather than dismissing it as mere coincidence or individual error, she began documenting other instances where groups of people exhibited the same erroneous recollections. One of the most famous examples involves the spelling of the children's book character Berenstain Bears, which millions of people remember as being spelled with an E in the last name, forming Berenstain, when in fact the official spelling has always been Berenstain with an a discrepancy that has spawned countless theories and explanations. Another widespread false memory concerns the Monopoly board game mascot, Mr. Monopoly, whom people across generations distinctly recall as wearing a monocle, a single eyepiece held in place near one eye, though examination of the game's history reveals that he has never actually worn a monocle and has only ever been depicted with both eyes visible and uncovered. These shared false memories appear to operate through a combination of psychological mechanisms that exploit the nature of human cognition and memory formation. The human brain does not record memories like a video camera capturing perfect duplicates of reality. Instead, memories are reconstructed each time they are recalled, rebuilt from fragments of information, and filled in with expectations, assumptions, and learned associations that seem to make sense within the context of what we already believe to be true. When multiple people encounter the same cultural product or historical event, they may all make similar logical inferences or assumptions based on patterns they have observed elsewhere, causing them to unconsciously alter their memories in identical ways without realizing they have done so. The Mandela Effect also thrives because of the power of suggestion and social reinforcement. When one person confidently asserts that something happened a particular way, other people who have vague or uncertain memories may unconsciously adopt that version of events, integrating it into their own recollection, and then defending it with increasing certainty as time passes and the false memory becomes more entrenched. Cultural narratives and semantic associations play a powerful role as well. For instance, the idea of a monocle seems perfectly suited to a wealthy, distinguished gentleman character like Mr. Monopoly. So people's minds essentially fill in this detail automatically because it fits the expected image so perfectly. What makes the Mandela Effect particularly fascinating and unsettling is that despite the availability of photographic evidence, historical documentation, and verifiable facts that directly contradict these shared false memories, the memories persist and often become even more resistant to correction once people become aware of the actual truth. Rather than abandoning their false recollections, people frequently rationalize the discrepancy by inventing elaborate explanations, suggesting that perhaps photographs have been doctored, that alternate timelines may have merged with our own, or that some form of mass manipulation has deliberately altered records to contradict what they remember experiencing. The Mandela Effect has essentially normalized the idea that large groups of people can be fundamentally mistaken about things they feel absolutely certain about, and this realization raises profound questions about the reliability of collective memory, the malleability of consciousness, and whether any of us can truly trust what we believe we remember with unwavering confidence. In an age where information is instantaneously accessible and verifiable facts are merely a search away, the persistence of the Mandela Effect suggests that our desire for narrative coherence and psychological comfort may ultimately override our commitment to objective truth, revealing that we are far more susceptible to the stories our minds construct than we might like to believe. This susceptibility becomes even more pronounced in our interconnected digital world, where false memories can spread virally across social media platforms, creating echo chambers where misinformation is constantly enforced and validated by thousands of like-minded believers who collectively convince one another of shared delusions. Imagine yourself walking into a coffee shop on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the same shop you have visited dozens of times before. Yet in this moment, something feels impossibly familiar in a way that transcends mere recognition. A sensation that you have lived this exact moment before, that you have seen these precise arrangements of tables and chairs, heard this specific conversation between the barista and a customer, felt this exact quality of light streaming through these windows. And despite knowing logically that this is impossible, that you have never experienced this specific configuration of events in this exact sequence, your mind insists with a strange certainty that you have been here, in this moment, doing exactly this thing before, and this feeling persists for seconds or sometimes minutes. A ghostly echo of familiarity that clings to your consciousness like a half-remembered dream you cannot quite grasp. This phenomenon, known as déjà vu, which translates from French as already seen, represents one of the most common yet profoundly mysterious glitches in human consciousness, affecting roughly 60 to 80% of people at some point in their lives, occurring most frequently in individuals between 15 and 25 years old, yet persisting across all ages and cultures and backgrounds. The prevailing scientific explanation suggests that déjà vu emerges from a temporary malfunction in the brain's memory retrieval systems, a brief disruption in the normal process by which your mind distinguishes between memories that are genuinely stored in your long-term memory and experiences that are occurring in real time in your present moment, a failure in what neuroscientists call the source monitoring process. Where your brain might access a genuine memory fragment or an accumulated pattern of similar experiences, and accidentally attribute that sense of familiarity to your current situation, creating a false match between present experience and past memory that feels absolutely convincing even as you simultaneously recognize its impossibility. Some researchers propose that déjà vu might occur when your brain processes sensory information twice, creating the strange illusion that you are remembering something you are currently experiencing, while others suggest that déjà vu emerges from the brain's tendency to unconsciously recognize patterns and similarities between the current moment and previous experiences. Assembling a gestalt of familiarity from elements that resemble past situations, even though the overall context is entirely new and unprecedented. Yet despite decades of scientific investigation, despite the development of theories and models and neurological explanations, déjà vu remains stubbornly resistant to complete understanding, resisting clear definition and consistent reproduction in laboratory settings, refusing to be photographed or measured directly. Existing only in the subjective reports of individuals who experience these fleeting moments of impossible recognition and cannot adequately convey to others the specific quality of that sensation, the particular flavor of certainty mixed with logical doubt. What is perhaps most remarkable about déjà vu is how thoroughly we have normalized this genuine anomaly, how we encounter it and shrug and accept it as simply another quirk of human consciousness, another inexplicable glitch that requires no explanation, a moment of strangeness that we file away and forget within hours, accepting that our minds occasionally betray us in ways we cannot fully understand, that consciousness itself contains hidden mechanisms we cannot access or verify, that the boundary between memory and perception and recognition can blur in ways that persist despite our scientific sophistication, and that something as fundamental as the question of how we know whether we have experienced something before remains ultimately beyond our complete comprehension, leaving us in the peculiar position of being thoroughly perplexed by our own minds, even as we navigate the world with confidence based on memories we cannot fully verify. Perhaps this is why déjà vu, despite its ubiquity, remains so unsettling. It offers us a glimpse into the vast machinery of consciousness operating beneath our awareness, reminding us that we are not transparent to ourselves, that the very faculties we rely upon to navigate reality are fundamentally opaque and occasionally unreliable, and that accepting this uncertainty about our own minds might be not a failure of science, but an honest acknowledgement of consciousness's irreducible mystery. Yet in those rare moments when déjà vu strikes, we are offered an unexpected gift, a brief window into the humbling reality that our consciousness remains a frontier we have barely begun to explore, and that perhaps the most profound scientific discovery would be finally understanding why our own minds feel so fundamentally strange to us. Consider the peculiar phenomenon wherein you begin a task with full awareness of the present moment, yet suddenly discover that hours have passed without your conscious accounting for them, a gap in your temporal experience that leaves no trace in your memory, despite the undeniable evidence of elapsed time marked by clocks and the changing position of the sun. You sit down to work on a single email at 9 in the morning, and the next coherent thought you have occurs when someone speaks your name, and you realize it is now nearly 1 o'clock, the intervening hours compressed into what felt like mere minutes of focused attention. Yet somehow you have accomplished substantial work without any sense of the duration it took. The mystery deepens when you attempt to reconstruct those missing hours and find that you cannot point to specific moments or transitions, no clear narrative of how time moved from one point to another, merely a blank interval bordered by two islands of clear consciousness. This phenomenon occurs not because time has actually changed its fundamental nature, but rather because your brain's temporal tracking system operates on multiple parallel channels, and when you enter what researchers call a flow state or hyperfocus condition, the prefrontal cortex essentially stops updating your subjective sense of duration. Your attention becomes so thoroughly absorbed by whatever task occupies your consciousness that the neural mechanisms responsible for time awareness, which normally tick away in the background of your mind like an internal clock, simply cease their regular reporting. The default mode network, which handles mind-wandering and self-referential thought, quiets down, and your brain stops its usual practice of checking in with itself about how much time has passed. Yet despite our understanding of this mechanism, despite the neuroscientific explanations and the documented evidence of how attention shapes temporal perception, we continue to experience these time slips as genuinely strange and disorienting phenomena. We have normalized the experience to the point where we simply shrug and accept that sometimes hours vanish, that our sense of time is fundamentally unreliable, that we cannot trust our own subjective experience of duration despite living inside these bodies and minds every moment of every day. We accept this radical untethering from temporal reality as merely an inconvenient quirk of human consciousness, rather than recognizing it as a profound glitch in the basic structure of how we experience existence. A crack in the supposedly seamless flow of time that should anchor us to reality, but instead reveals that time itself might be far more malleable and subjective than our waking logic suggests. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves simultaneously terrified and oddly comforted by the idea that time might not be the rigid, measurable thing we pretend it is. Because deep down, we recognize that our subjective experience of duration, however unreliable, might be closer to the truth of how we actually live than any clock could ever measure. We live most authentically not in the moments we can account for, but in those we cannot, in the hours that disappear while we create something, connect with someone, or lose ourselves entirely in work that matters enough to make time irrelevant. In this sense, the time we cannot measure might be precisely the time we are most alive. And yet, we rarely celebrate these unmeasured hours. Instead, we panic about deadlines missed, emails unanswered, the external world's relentless demand that we account for every moment. Perhaps the real tragedy of time slips is not that we lose hours, but that we have been taught to mourn their loss rather than to recognize them as evidence that we are capable of transcendence, that somewhere beneath our anxious, clock-watching selves lives a consciousness still able to slip free from time's tyranny if only we could learn to let it. Yet the irony is that we rarely grant ourselves this permission. We are too busy measuring the unmeasured time, too anxious about its absence from our schedules, too conditioned by the external world's demand for productivity to simply sit with the possibility that the hours that vanish might be the truest measure of a life fully lived, moments when we stop asking whether we are doing enough and simply become enough in the doing itself. And so we return to our desks, to our clocks, to the familiar anxiety of accounting for ourselves, knowing all the while that the most meaningful hours of our lives will likely remain forever unmeasured, existing only as the subtle weight of accomplishment and the faint bewilderment of having been somewhere we cannot quite locate in time. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves oddly reluctant to optimize these moments away, why even as we implement time-tracking apps and productivity systems, some part of us resists the impulse to measure what cannot be misu. Read without destroying it, recognizing, even if we cannot quite articulate it, that the unmeasured hours are where we meet ourselves most honestly, where the self that exists beyond prod. Imagine a barrier with two narrow openings side by side, with a light source on one side and a detection screen on the other, and what happens when you perform this deceptively simple setup reveals something so fundamentally unsettling about reality that physicists still struggle to articulate it without sounding like they are describing science fiction rather than established fact. When light passes through these two slits simultaneously, it behaves like a wave, creating an interference pattern on the screen where the waves from each slit amplify or cancel each other out, producing alternating bands of brightness and darkness that would be entirely expected from any classical wave phenomenon in nature. However, the moment you attempt to observe which slit the light actually passes through by placing a detector at either opening, the light immediately changes its behavior and behaves like a particle instead, passing through one slit or the other but not both, and the interference pattern collapses into two simple bands, as if the light had been forced to make a choice about its identity the instant you tried to catch it in the act. This phenomenon appears to suggest that the universe operates according to a strange rule, wherein observation itself determines reality rather than merely revealing it, and that particles exist in a state of probabilistic potential until the moment consciousness or measurement forces them to commit to a definite state, almost as though the universe maintains a kind of secretive behavior that only manifests when we stop looking closely enough. The psychological mechanism behind our acceptance of this glitch in reality seems to operate through a process of intellectual compartmentalization, wherein scientists and educated people acknowledge that this is genuinely how nature functions at the quantum scale, while simultaneously maintaining their everyday perception that reality is solid, deterministic, and independent of observation. Creating a cognitive separation between the theoretical universe and the experienced universe that allows us to function normally despite knowing that at the smallest scales, reality responds to our attention and awareness. We have so thoroughly normalized this impossibility that it appears in every physics textbook, is confirmed through countless reproducible experiments, and yet remains fundamentally incomprehensible to the human mind that evolved to understand medium-sized objects moving at moderate speeds in predictable ways, leaving us in the position of accepting a universe that operates by rules that contradict our intuitive understanding of how anything could possibly work. And perhaps most unsettling of all, this isn't merely a limitation of our current understanding that future physicists might resolve. It appears to be a fundamental feature of reality itself, suggesting that the universe at its deepest level is less like a clockwork mechanism ticking away independently and more like an interactive system where the act of asking a question about nature genuinely reshapes the answer nature provides. Some physicists have proposed that this participatory universe might extend even further, that perhaps the cosmos itself required observers to collapse the initial quantum foam into the structured reality we inhabit, making consciousness not merely a witness to creation but a requirement for it, though such ideas remain controversial precisely because they blur the line between physics and philosophy in ways that make rigorous science deeply uncomfortable. Yet when we actually perform the experiment in our laboratories, the results remain perfectly consistent and reproducible, suggesting that whatever interpretive framework we choose, whether we embrace the observer effect, the many worlds hypothesis, or some yet undiscovered mechanism, the universe operates with a precision that belies any suggestion of randomness or chaos, as if reality is simultaneously dependent on observation and utterly indifferent to our philosophical anxieties about it. Perhaps the most pragmatic response is to simply accept that the double-slit experiment works exactly as described, use that knowledge to build quantum computers and lasers that function with extraordinary precision, and recognize that our discomfort with the mechanism may say more about the limitations of human intuition than about any flaw in the universe's design. After all, the fact that we can harness quantum mechanics to create technologies that were once deemed impossible, from semiconductors that power every device in your pocket to quantum entanglement-based cryptography that may eventually secure our most sensitive information, suggests that whatever the universe is doing at the quantum level, our pragmatic acceptance of it, even without complete comprehension, has proven far more valuable than waiting for intuitive understanding that may never arrive. The quantum realm has thus become less a mystery to solve, and more a language to fluently speak, even if we cannot fully visualize what we are saying. Imagine two particles separated by vast distances across the universe, perhaps one on Earth and another on the far side of a galaxy, yet somehow mysteriously connected through an invisible bond that operates instantaneously the moment one particle's state changes, with the other particle responding immediately as though receiving an instantaneous signal that should be physically impossible according to our understanding of how the universe works. Yet this phenomenon has been repeatedly verified through countless laboratory experiments conducted by physicists over decades of rigorous scientific study. When scientists measure the spin of one entangled particle and find it rotating clockwise, the other particle's spin instantaneously becomes counterclockwise, no matter the distance separating them, as if they share a single quantum state despite existing in completely different locations in spacetime. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to operate through what physicists describe as a shared quantum state that was established when the particles were created together or brought into proximity, creating a correlation between them that persists across any separation, though the information about which particle will be in which state remains fundamentally undetermined until the moment of measurement. This correlation violates classical intuitions about locality and separability that shaped scientific thinking for centuries, suggesting that particles maintain connections that transcend the spatial separation we observe in the macroscopic world. Yet rather than treating this as a fundamental breakdown of physics requiring complete conceptual overhaul, the scientific community has largely normalized quantum entanglement into standard theoretical frameworks. We have accepted that reality at its smallest scales operates according to principles that defy our everyday understanding without requiring philosophical resolution or existential reckoning, instead incorporating entanglement into working models of quantum mechanics and using it for practical applications in quantum computing and cryptography, as though a phenomenon this strange and counterintuitive simply deserves to be filed away among the other accepted mysteries of existence. Despite remaining genuinely inexplicable through any mechanism that aligns with our intuitive understanding of how separate objects should behave, quantum entanglement has become routine in scientific discourse, taught in universities as established fact rather than persistent paradox, normalized through mathematical elegance rather than conceptual clarity, suggesting that humanity possesses a remarkable capacity to accept the incomprehensible simply through the process of making it familiar. Perhaps this very habituation, the ease with which we transform the bewildering into the mundane through repetition and mathematical formalism, reveals something profound about human cognition itself. Our minds possess an extraordinary talent for expanding beyond their evolutionary origins, accepting as reasonable what our ancestors could never have conceived, until the impossible becomes merely another chapter in the textbook of known physics. Yet in accepting quantum entanglement so readily, we may have also accepted a kind of intellectual surrender, a willingness to use and predict phenomena without truly understanding them, to build technologies upon foundations we cannot fully comprehend, and to live comfortably with the knowledge that the universe at its most fundamental level operates according to rules that remain, perhaps permanently, beyond the reach of human intuition. This acceptance of the incomprehensible may represent either a profound humility, an acknowledgement that human understanding has limits, or a subtle form of intellectual complacency, where we mistake mathematical predictability for genuine comprehension, substituting equations for insight and calling it progress. Yet perhaps this distinction itself, between prediction and understanding, dissolves upon closer inspection, for what else is understanding but the ability to predict and manipulate phenomena with increasing precision, suggesting that our comfort with quantum entanglement's mathematical formalism may represent not surrender but evolution, a recognition that some truths reveal themselves only through equations rather than mechanical analogies, and that the universe owes us neither intuitive comprehensibility nor explanatory comfort. The entanglement experiments themselves, Bell's theorem, the loopholes systematically closed over decades, the recent loophole-free tests confirming correlations stronger than any classical explanation permits, stand as monuments to this evolved understanding, where each experimental refinement narrows the space for alternative explanations until we are left not with comfort but with certainty. The universe genuinely behaves this way, regardless of whether our intuitions can accommodate. Imagine stepping into your car in the driveway of your home, checking the clock on the dashboard which reads 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then suddenly becoming aware of your surroundings again, only to discover that you have arrived at your destination 45 minutes away. Yet the clock now reads 3:47. The drive should have taken nearly an hour, perhaps longer depending on traffic conditions, yet somehow you have lost nearly 15 minutes from your conscious experience, and you cannot recall a single moment of the journey itself, not the turns you made, not the traffic lights you passed through, not the songs that played on your radio or the thoughts that occupied your mind. This phenomenon, known as missing time, represents one of the most unsettling glitches in our perception of temporal continuity, where segments of time seemingly vanish from our awareness without explanation or warning. People report these experiences with remarkable consistency across different cultures and demographics, describing periods ranging from a few minutes to several hours during which their memories simply cease to record information, leaving behind only a gap where experience should exist. The experience often leaves individuals with a profound sense of disorientation and concern, as though something fundamental about the reliability of their own consciousness has been compromised. The mechanism behind missing time appears to be rooted in a psychological phenomenon called highway hypnosis or automaticity, wherein the brain enters a state of such deep routine engagement that conscious awareness essentially disengages from moment-to-moment processing. When we perform highly familiar tasks, such as driving a route we travel frequently, our brains develop automated neural pathways that require minimal conscious attention, allowing us to complete complex actions while our awareness drifts to other concerns or falls into a state of reduced consciousness altogether. During these periods, we remain capable of executing the necessary motor functions and even making basic decisions, yet we form no lasting memories of the experience because the information never fully registers in our working memory or long-term storage systems. The brain prioritizes resource allocation, and when it perceives that a task requires only automated responses, it essentially withdraws conscious surveillance from that activity, allowing our awareness to drift into an unfocused state or become absorbed in internal thoughts. This represents an elegant efficiency mechanism that has evolved within human cognition, yet it simultaneously creates these peculiar temporal absences where time passes but leaves no experiential trace. What makes missing time particularly unsettling is how completely normal and commonplace this mechanism actually is, despite how thoroughly it violates our expectations about the continuity of consciousness. We have all experienced it to some degree, perhaps while reading a page in a book only to realize we absorbed nothing and must begin again, or during a conversation when we suddenly notice that several minutes have passed and we have no recollection of what was said. Society has largely normalized these occurrences, treating them as minor curiosities rather than profound glitches in our awareness, yet the implications remain deeply strange and unresolved. We trust our consciousness to remain present and engaged with our lives, yet we accept without serious examination that significant portions of our existence regularly slip away unrecorded and unremembered. The fact that our brains can successfully navigate complex environments and complete intricate tasks, while our conscious minds are entirely absent, raises fundamental questions about what consciousness actually is, and whether the continuous sense of self we experience is merely an illusion constructed by memory rather than a genuine moment-to-moment presence throughout our lives. Perhaps this is why the experience of missing time unsettles us so profoundly. It offers a glimpse behind the curtain of our own minds, revealing that the self we believe to be continuously present throughout our days may be far more fragmented and intermittent than we care to admit, a series of conscious moments stitched together by memory into the convincing illusion of an unbroken existence. Consider the implications. If we cannot trust our moment-to-moment consciousness to record our experiences, then perhaps the most honest assessment of human existence is not that we live through our days, but that we construct a narrative of having lived through them, assembling fragments of memory into a coherent story that feels far more continuous and intentional than the actual subjective reality of our broken, interrupted awareness. This realization might explain why we feel compelled to document our lives obsessively through photographs and journals, not merely to preserve memories, but to create external evidence that we were truly present for moments our consciousness may have abandoned, transforming the fragmented record of our awareness into something resembling. Consider the moment when you reach for a doorknob that isn't quite where your brain calculated it to be, or when you step down from a stair that doesn't exist in the darkness of your home, that sudden jarring sensation that floods your body with adrenaline despite there being no actual danger. These are glitch experiences, moments where the seamless integration between your perception and reality fractures just enough to remind you that your brain is constantly constructing an approximate model of the world rather than experiencing it directly. Your sensory systems are gathering information from your environment, but your brain is not passively receiving this data like a camera recording footage. Instead, it is actively predicting what it expects to encounter based on past experiences, memories, learned patterns, and contextual clues. And it is only when reality deviates significantly from these predictions that you become consciously aware of the discrepancy. When you miss a stare or reach for something in the wrong place, your cerebellum and proprioceptive systems have already begun executing motor commands based on predictions that turn out to be incorrect. And this mismatch between expectation and actual sensory feedback creates that unsettling glitch sensation, a moment where the illusion of seamless reality temporarily breaks down and you glimpse the computational machinery underneath. These glitch experiences happen constantly throughout our daily existence, but we rarely notice them because our brains are extraordinarily good at error correction, and because most of these minor predictive failures happen at the subconscious level where we cannot access them directly. The persistence of these glitches, despite their obvious lack of logical necessity, speaks to something fundamental about consciousness itself. Our brains are energy-expensive organs running on biochemical batteries, and it would be wasteful for them to process every single piece of sensory information with complete attention and perfect precision. Instead, evolution has designed our nervous systems to run mostly on autopilot, using automatic processes and predictive models to handle routine situations while reserving conscious attention for novel or important events. This system works remarkably well most of the time, but it creates opportunities for glitches because your brain is essentially running a continuous simulation of the world, and sometimes that simulation gets out of sync with reality. The fact that we have normalized this aspect of human experience, rarely discussing these minor perceptual failures or treating them as significant, suggests how thoroughly we have accepted the idea that our experience of reality is not a direct window into what is happening around us, but rather a constructed representation generated by our brains and therefore inherently subject to imperfection and discontinuity. Yet this acceptance masks a deeper truth. These glitches are not merely failures of perception, but windows into how consciousness itself operates, revealing that the self-experiencing reality is not a unified observer, but rather an ongoing process of prediction, correction, and narrative construction that your brain performs so smoothly you mistake it for direct experience. When you misremember a conversation or suddenly cannot recall why you entered a room, you are experiencing the same fundamental phenomenon, the gap between what your brain constructed and what actually occurred. Except now the glitch is temporal rather than spatial, revealing that even your sense of continuous selfhood across time is a narrative your brain assembles after the fact rather than something you experience in real time. Your brain is so committed to maintaining this narrative continuity that it will actually fill in gaps and fabricate details to smooth over these temporal glitches, constructing false memories of seamless experience where discontinuity actually occurred, which means that what you experience as your unified, continuous self is partly fiction, a story your brain tells itself to make sense of the fragmentary, glitchy nature of actual conscious experience. The most unsettling implication is that you cannot trust your own sense of continuity. The feeling that you are the same person who woke up this morning is itself a glitch-prone reconstruction, a best guess your brain makes based on fragmentary memories and narrative patterns, which means the unified self you take for granted is less a discovered fact of your existence and more an ongoing hallucination that your brain maintains with remarkable consistency but imperfect fidelity to what actually occurred. And yet, despite this fundamentally unreliable nature of consciousness, you continue navigating the world as though your experience were unmediated and complete, which is perhaps the deepest glitch of all, not a failure of your brain's systems, but their success at concealing their own operation. As so thoroughly that you forget they are operations at all, operations that could fail, that do fail constantly, that are failing right now in ways you will never detect. Consider the peculiar phenomenon that occurs whenever you become acutely aware that you are being observed, and notice how your behavior shifts in ways you cannot fully explain or control, as though the simple act of knowing you are watched somehow alters the fundamental nature of what you're doing, much like how quantum particles behave differently when measured versus when left unmeasured in the absence of observation. In everyday life, this manifests in countless subtle ways that we rarely acknowledge consciously, such as when you walk differently when you know someone is watching you, when your facial expression changes the moment you catch sight of your reflection in a mirror or window, when your performance in an athletic competition or musical recital transforms entirely because an audience has gathered to witness it, or when your conversation with a friend becomes noticeably different the instant another person joins your dialogue and begins listening. This observer effect extends into the realm of psychology as well, where subjects in scientific studies have been shown to alter their behaviors, answer questions differently, and respond to stimuli in ways that diverge significantly from how they would behave if they believed no one was recording their actions or measuring their responses. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to be rooted in our deep evolutionary awareness that we are social creatures whose survival has always depended upon our ability to navigate the judgments, perceptions, and reactions of other members of our groups. And consequently, our brains have developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the presence of observers, activating what researchers call the spotlight effect, where we become hyper-aware of ourselves and consequently self-conscious about our presentation to others. What makes this truly remarkable, however, is that this observer effect persists with remarkable consistency even when we logically understand the mechanism, even when we consciously remind ourselves that the observer may not be judging us at all, even when we know that most people are far too preoccupied with their own self-image to devote significant mental resources to criticizing ours, and yet still we find ourselves unable to fully suppress the behavioral shift. The slight tension in our posture, the careful modulation of our voice, the deliberate selection of our words. We have built entire systems around this glitch in human nature, from job interviews where both parties perform exaggerated versions of themselves, to social media platforms where billions of people curate and present carefully constructed versions of their lives to invisible audiences. And we have normalized this constant state of being observed, either actually or potentially, to such a profound degree that we rarely pause to consider how extraordinary it is that the mere possibility of observation can fundamentally alter our reality, our choices, our very selves, creating a world where authenticity becomes increasingly rare and the line between who we actually are and who we present ourselves to be grows ever more blurred and difficult to discern. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this phenomenon is that we have begun to internalize the observer itself, developing an internal critic so vigilant and exacting that we monitor our own behavior with the same scrutiny we fear from others, meaning that even in complete solitude, we remain perpetually watched, if only by ourselves. And in this way, the observer effect completes its circle. We become both the watched and the watcher, creating an endless hall of mirrors where authentic spontaneity seems almost impossible to access, and we find ourselves performing not just for others, but for an internalized audience that may be far more demanding and unforgiving than any external eye could ever be. Yet paradoxically, this internalized observer might also be our greatest teacher and moral compass, the part of ourselves that prevents us from acting on our basest impulses and holds us accountable to our own stated values, suggesting that perhaps the observer effect, for all its capacity to distort and diminish authenticity, also contains within it the mechanism by which we become more thoughtful, more considerate, and more intentionally ourselves rather than merely reactively ourselves. The challenge, then, becomes learning to distinguish between the observer within us that elevates our better nature and the one that merely constrains us through fear, between the internalized voice that guides us toward genuine integrity and the one that merely enforces conformity to external expectations we never chose to adopt. This discernment may be the most valuable skill we can develop in a world where we are perpetually observed, allowing us to harness the observer effect's capacity for self-improvement while reclaiming the spontaneity and authenticity that make us genuine. Lie human. Consider for a moment the simple act of seeing the color red, or feeling the warmth of sunlight on your skin, or tasting chocolate on your tongue, and ask yourself a question that has haunted philosophers and neuroscientists for centuries. Why does any of this feel like something at all? We can map the neural correlates of consciousness with increasing precision. We can identify which regions of the brain activate when you perceive color or experience emotion. We can trace the electrochemical cascades that occur when light enters your eye and signals travel through your visual cortex. And yet something remains fundamentally unexplained, a gap that grows wider the more we learn. This is the hard problem of consciousness, and it represents perhaps the most peculiar glitch in the fabric of our understanding of reality, because it is not that we lack data or observations, but rather that the very nature of subjective experience seems to exist in a dimension that our current scientific frameworks cannot access or describe. When you see red, your brain processes certain wavelengths of light, your neurons fire in particular patterns, your consciousness registers a quale, which is the technical term for the felt quality of an experience, and we can measure every physical aspect of this process except the one thing that matters most, the internal sensation of redness itself. You could theoretically create a duplicate of your entire brain down to the atomic level, and this duplicate brain would process information identically to yours, would behave identically, would claim to see red in exactly the way you do, and yet there would be no way to know if its internal experience of redness resembles yours even remotely, or if perhaps the color appears entirely different to that other consciousness, or if there is any experience present at all behind those words. This explanatory gap between objective physical description and subjective phenomenal experience has persisted through decades of neuroscientific advancement, and it persists because consciousness seems to belong to a category of phenomenon that resists the standard methods of scientific inquiry, which work by reducing complex systems into their constituent parts and measuring their interactions. But you cannot reduce the feeling of red into smaller and smaller components and expect to find where the feeling itself resides, because the feeling is not a component, it is not a physical property in any conventional sense. It is something altogether different, something that exists only from the first-person perspective, only in the presence of a subject experiencing it. And yet we navigate the world as if this problem does not exist. We treat consciousness as a solved mystery or a future puzzle to be worked out. We build artificial intelligence systems and debate whether they might be conscious someday. We develop theories about consciousness emerging from neural complexity. And we continue forward in our scientific and philosophical work despite this fundamental uncertainty about what consciousness even is, or how physical matter could ever give rise to the felt quality of experience in the first place. And perhaps this normalization of the inexplicable is itself the deepest glitch of all. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that this gap may not be a temporary limitation of our current science, but rather a fundamental boundary between types of knowledge, a suggestion that subjective experience might be inherently private, forever resistant to the third-person methodology that has driven all our scientific progress, leaving consciousness as the one phenomenon we can never fully explain precisely because we are always already trapped inside it. We might spend centuries mapping every synapse and neurotransmitter, cataloging the precise physical correlates of every conscious state, and still face the same unanswerable question. Why does any of it feel like anything at all? The hard problem persists not because we lack instruments, but because consciousness appears to operate according to rules fundamentally different from everything else we have learned to measure and understand. And so we are left with a peculiar situation. Consciousness is the most immediate and undeniable fact of our existence, the only thing we know with absolute certainty, and yet it remains the most scientifically intractable, suggesting that perhaps the hard problem is not a gap in our knowledge, but rather a fundamental mismatch between the nature of the phenomenon and the nature of scientific inquiry itself. We might wonder whether a complete physics of the universe could exist, one that predicts every particle's position and motion with perfect accuracy, and still leave consciousness entirely unexplained, suggesting that some aspects of reality may simply fall outside the domain of what science is equipped to describe, no matter how sophisticated our instruments become. Consider the peculiar position of a person who has been experiencing chronic pain for months, pain that has resisted conventional treatment and left them exhausted by the weight of their own suffering, and then they are given what they believe to be a powerful new medication by a doctor they trust deeply. A pill that comes in a pristine container with an official label and a confident prescription, and within days or weeks their pain begins to diminish, their sleep improves, their outlook brightens. And their body responds as though something genuinely medicinal has occurred within their chemistry and physiology, when in fact the pill they have been taking contains nothing but inert ingredients, a substance with no pharmacological properties whatsoever, and yet the healing happens nonetheless, real and measurable and documented across thousands of clinical trials and medical records throughout the history of modern healthcare. The placebo effect represents one of the most perplexing contradictions in human biology, a glitch in the relationship between expectation and reality that fundamentally challenges our understanding of how bodies actually work. Because what occurs is not merely psychological theater or conscious self-deception, but rather a genuine biological response that emerges from the architecture of belief itself. From the way that our brains and nervous systems are wired to translate expectation into neurochemical reality, to manufacture actual physiological changes through the sheer force of conviction and the power of contextual meaning. When a person believes they have received treatment, their brain anticipates healing and consequently releases endogenous opioids and other neurochemicals that reduce pain perception, lower inflammation markers, improve immune function, regulate heart rate and blood pressure, and fundamentally alter the body's stress response. And these are not imagined improvements, but rather measurable changes that can be detected through brain imaging and blood work and clinical observation. Yet the triggering mechanism remains entirely disconnected from any actual pharmaceutical intervention, depending instead on ritual and authority and the deep human need to trust in our own recovery. The persistence of the placebo effect, despite our scientific understanding of its mechanisms, reveals something disturbing about the nature of medicine itself, and the way we have organized healthcare around the assumption that healing comes from external substances rather than from the elaborate expectations we construct around those substances. And the most unsettling aspect is that knowing something is a placebo does not always eliminate its effects. As studies have demonstrated that placebos can still produce measurable benefits even when patients are explicitly told they are receiving inert treatment, that the ritual and the context and the cultural meaning we have assigned to medical intervention appear to matter more than the actual chemical composition of what we consume. We have built an entire medical establishment on the foundation of the placebo effect without fully acknowledging how much of healing depends on expectation and meaning rather than mechanism. And we continue to normalize this strange glitch in human biology by incorporating placebos into every clinical trial and by designing medical experiences that maximize the psychological context of healing, the white coat and the sterile office and the official language of diagnosis. Understanding on some unspoken level that the reality of medicine is inseparable from the theater of medicine, that the most powerful drug ever invented is the human brain's capacity to believe in recovery. And perhaps this is not a flaw in our biology, but rather an evolutionary advantage, a reminder that survival has always depended less on the objective properties of our environment than on our ability to interpret it, to find meaning in chaos, and to mobilize our bodies toward healing through the stories we tell ourselves about what is possible. The nocebo effect, where negative expectations produce genuine harm, demonstrates that this power cuts both directions, that we are equally capable of manufacturing illness through belief, suggesting that the mind's influence over matter is not a quirk of consciousness, but rather a fundamental feature of embodied existence, a truth that transforms how we should think about responsibility, hope, and the stories we choose to inhabit. If we accept that our narratives about illness and recovery literally reshape our biology, then the stories we tell ourselves about our own fragility or resilience become not merely comforting fictions, but actual determinants of our physical fate, which means that hope itself is a form of medicine with measurable dosage requirements, and despair is a toxin that poisons not through its truth, but through its persuasive power over our flesh. We see this most starkly in the stories of patients who recover from terminal diagnoses after radical shifts in belief, or conversely, in the documented deaths of those who surrendered to the narrative of their own doom. There exists a peculiar phenomenon where unrelated events seem to align in ways that feel far too deliberate to be mere chance, moments where the universe appears to be communicating with you through a language of coincidence, and this happens with such frequency and precision in the lives of ordinary people that we have developed an entire conceptual framework around it, calling it synchronicity, a term that suggests meaningful coincidence without requiring causation. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this glitch in reality is how perfectly it operates within the margins of plausibility, existing in that liminal space where probability theory cannot quite explain it away, but scientific methodology cannot quite validate it either. Consider the person who thinks of an old friend they have not spoken to in years, and within hours that friend calls them, or the individual who encounters the same obscure word 3 times in a single day across completely unrelated contexts, or the moment when you look at the clock and it reads 11:11, and this happens so frequently that you begin to notice it, and the very act of noticing creates a feedback loop that makes it seem even more significant. And yet millions of people experience these moments with such consistency that they have become a recognized cultural touchstone, referenced in literature and philosophy and self-help books, treated as if they carry some deeper meaning about the nature of consciousness and connection. The psychological explanation for synchronicity rests primarily on the concept of cognitive bias, specifically selective attention and confirmation bias, wherein your brain becomes exceptionally skilled at filtering through the infinite noise of daily experience and highlighting only those coincidences that feel meaningful, while systematically ignoring the thousands of times similar events failed to align. And this selectivity is not a flaw in human perception, but rather an evolved feature that allowed our ancestors to recognize patterns that could indicate danger or opportunity. Yet in the modern world, this same mechanism creates an illusion of meaningful connection where none necessarily exists, and we notice when the phone rings right as we think of someone, but we do not notice all the times we think of someone and the phone does not ring, creating a deeply skewed perception of how often these alignments actually occur. What makes synchronicity particularly troubling as a glitch in reality is that it persists in our collective consciousness despite our ability to explain it away with statistics and cognitive science. And we have largely normalized it, accepting these coincidences as small wonders rather than examining whether we are experiencing genuine meaningful alignment or whether we are simply witnessing our own minds imposing pattern and meaning onto randomness. And yet people continue to consult tarot cards and horoscopes and numerology as if the universe is actively trying to communicate through these coincidental arrangements, suggesting that perhaps the explanation is not the important part, but rather the experience itself, the sensation that the world is responding to your inner life, that reality is listening somehow, and this belief persists because it serves a psychological function. Offering comfort in a chaotic universe where we are fundamentally small and powerless, providing a sense of connection and destiny that is difficult to relinquish even in the face of logical explanation. And perhaps that is the true glitch, not that synchronicity exists, but that we need it to exist so desperately that we continue to believe in it regardless of what our rational mind tells us about probability and pattern recognition. And so we find ourselves trapped in a strange bargain with our own perception, where the comforting narrative of a responsive universe becomes more valuable than the truth of random occurrence, and we choose again and again to interpret the world as meaningful because the alternative, that we are simply conscious observers of indifferent chaos, feels too lonely to bear. Perhaps this is why synchronicity remains one of reality's most persistent glitches, not because the universe is communicating, but because we have collectively decided that the story of connection is worth more than the story of isolation, and in choosing meaning over randomness, we transform ourselves into the very force that makes coincidence feel alive. In this way, synchronicity becomes less a glitch in reality and more a glitch in how we perceive reality. A beautiful malfunction where our desperate need for meaning rewrites the rules of probability itself, and we become co-creators of the very coincidences we believe we are merely witnessing, our consciousness folding the odds in favor of the narratives we most need to be true. And in this way, the greatest synchronicity of all may be that billions of minds, operating independently across the globe, have each arrived at the same conclusion, that meaning is worth manufacturing, that connection is worth believing in, even if we must construct it ourselves from the R. Consider for a moment the peculiar experience of remembering an event that never actually occurred, of possessing a detailed recollection so vivid and emotionally resonant that it feels as authentic as any genuine memory you possess. Yet when you examine the evidence or speak with others who were supposedly present, you discover that this memory is fundamentally false, that it never happened in the way you remember it, or perhaps never happened at all. This is the phenomenon of false memories, and it represents one of the most unsettling glitches in the architecture of human consciousness, because it undermines the very foundation upon which we build our sense of self and continuity. You might recall with perfect clarity a conversation that never took place, or remember attending an event that you were actually absent from, or feel certain that someone said something to you that they insist they never said. And the strange part is that these false memories are not vague or dreamlike, but often contain precise details, emotional textures, and sensory components that make them indistinguishable from authentic memories in the moment of recall. The mechanism behind false memories involves the reconstructive nature of human memory itself, which operates less like a video recording and more like a constantly reassembled narrative constructed from fragmented pieces of experience, emotional associations, and contextual information. When you retrieve a memory, your brain does not simply play back a stored file, but rather reconstructs the experience using various neural networks and associations, filling in gaps with reasonable assumptions and incorporating suggestions from external sources, conversations, or even media exposure that you may not consciously recognize as separate from your direct experience. The brain synthesizes these components into a cohesive narrative that feels continuous and real, and in the process, it can inadvertently blend actual events with imagined or suggested scenarios, creating false memories that feel just as true as genuine ones because they activate the same neural pathways and emotional responses. What makes this phenomenon particularly disturbing is that false memories persist even when we possess logical knowledge that contradicts them, even when we have evidence that something could not have happened the way we remember it, and yet the memory remains, stubbornly occupying space in our sense of identity and personal history. We have normalized this glitch so thoroughly that we rarely acknowledge how deeply it undermines our capacity for certain knowledge about our own lives, how we accept that our memories can betray us without fundamentally questioning what this means for the reliability of consciousness itself, and how we continue to navigate relationships and decisions based on recollections that may be partially or entirely constructed rather than retrieved from actual experience. Yet perhaps most troubling is that we cannot develop a reliable internal mechanism to distinguish true memories from false ones. No feeling, no quality of certainty, no sensory detail serves as a definitive marker of authenticity, which means that even as you read this and feel confident in your memories of your own life, you must accept the possibility that some portion of your personal history is fundamentally unreliable, reconstructed rather than remembered. And that this uncertainty is not a flaw you can correct, but an inescapable feature of how human consciousness operates. The implications extend beyond personal embarrassment or occasional confusion about past events. They suggest that the self you experience as a continuous knowable entity is in fact a narrative construction maintained by a brain that regularly revises its own history, meaning that your identity is built not on solid ground, but on a foundation of stories your mind tells itself, some true and some elaborately false, all equally convincing in the moment of their recall. And if the self is fundamentally a story we tell ourselves, then perhaps the distinction between true and false memories matters less than we assume. What matters is only that the narrative holds together, that it feels coherent and consistent enough to navigate another day, which means we are all living inside stories we cannot fully verify, accepting as real the versions of our lives that our minds have constructed for us, whether or not those versions correspond to what actually occurred. This realization invites a strange kind of humility. We become unreliable narrators of our own existence, unable to trust the very memories that feel most vivid and essential to who we believe ourselves to be, yet we persist in treating these reconstructed narratives as foundations for judgment, relationship, and self-understanding, knowing all the while that we are building upon sand that shifts beneath our feet with every act of remembrance. And yet we cling to these narratives. Anyway, because the alternative, acknowledging that we cannot truly know our own past, feels like a dissolution of self too profound to bear, so we continue forward, memory after memory. Imagine walking into a room in your own home, a place you have entered thousands of times before, and suddenly experiencing a complete and overwhelming sense of unfamiliarity, as though you have never seen it in your entire life, despite knowing intellectually that you have walked through this threshold countless times and know every detail of its layout with perfect certainty. This is the phenomenon known as Jamais vu, which translates from French as never seen, and it represents perhaps one of the most disorienting inversions of the more commonly discussed déjà vu experience. Where déjà vu tricks us into believing we have experienced something before when we have not, Jamais vu accomplishes the opposite trick, convincing our minds that something achingly familiar is instead profoundly alien and strange. The feeling typically arrives without warning and without any logical trigger, arriving like an unwanted visitor during moments when you are simply going about your ordinary day, engaged in routine activities that should feel automatic and unremarkable. Your brain suddenly begins to question the reality of your surroundings, making you wonder if you are truly in the place you believe yourself to be, or if perhaps something fundamental about your memory and perception has shifted in ways you cannot quite understand. The sensation typically lasts only seconds or minutes, though subjectively it can feel far longer, and it often leaves you feeling deeply unsettled even after the episode has passed and normalcy has returned. The psychological mechanism behind Jamais vu appears to be rooted in a temporary disruption of the neural systems that process familiarity and memory recognition, though neuroscientists still struggle to fully explain why this disruption occurs in otherwise healthy brains. Research suggests that the brain relies on what is called fluency of processing, which is the ease and smoothness with which your mind can retrieve and access familiar information and memories. When this processing occurs automatically, without conscious effort, your brain interprets the situation as familiar and known. However, during a Jamais vu episode, this system appears to temporarily malfunction, causing the brain to somehow disconnect these familiar stimuli from their associated memories and context. The information enters your consciousness, but it arrives without the emotional and associative tags that normally signal familiarity, leading to a strange dissociation where you perceive something as simultaneously known and unknown. Some researchers propose that this might involve a temporary disconnection between the regions of the brain responsible for perception and those responsible for memory retrieval, creating a situation where your eyes and senses are telling you one thing, but your memory systems are not confirming what you are experiencing. Others suggest that Jamais vu might represent a brief failure in the brain's ability to properly consolidate and access semantic memory, which is the part of memory responsible for general knowledge and facts about the world and yourself. The persistence of Jamais vu experiences in human populations, despite our modern understanding of neuroscience and psychology, speaks to something profound about the inherent mysteries that still remain embedded within the architecture of human consciousness and perception. We have normalized this experience enough to give it a name and to discuss it casually in conversation, yet we have done remarkably little to prevent it or to understand precisely why it occurs when it does. Medical science cannot reliably predict who will experience Jamais vu or when these episodes will strike, and no pharmaceutical intervention or psychological technique has proven effective at either preventing the phenomenon or extending it once it has begun. The experience remains essentially untreatable and unexplainable at the level of individual occurrence, despite our confident assertions about its psychological and neurological foundations. This gap between our theoretical understanding and our practical inability to control or predict the phenomenon reveals how much of human neurology remains fundamentally resistant to complete explanation, how many of the everyday quirks of consciousness still operate according to rules that we have yet to fully decipher. We accept Jamais vu as simply one of those strange things that human brains sometimes do, much like we accept countless other small glitches in our mental processes, and we move forward in our lives knowing that at any moment, the familiar might suddenly become profoundly and inexplicably strange. Perhaps the unsettling power of Jamais vu lies precisely in this unpredictability, in the reminder that our sense of home, of self, of continuity and belonging depends entirely on neural processes that can falter without warning, leaving us momentarily unmoored from the anchors of familiarity that typical lie give structure and meaning to our lived experience. Near-death experiences represent one of the most persistent and widespread anomalies in human consciousness, occurring when individuals find themselves in situations of extreme physiological stress or clinical death, only to report profound sensory and emotional phenomena that seem to transcend the boundaries of what neuroscience can adequately explain. These experiences typically unfold with remarkable consistency across cultures, geographies, and time periods, featuring a distinctive sequence of events that includes a sensation of leaving one's body, moving through darkness or a tunnel, encountering deceased relatives or spiritual entities, experiencing overwhelming peace and unconditional love, and often encountering a bright light of ineffable beauty and significance. People who have undergone these experiences commonly describe a sense of profound clarity and purpose, a dissolution of fear regarding death itself, and a fundamental reorganization of their values and priorities upon returning to their physical bodies. Yet the mechanisms by which a brain starved of oxygen and electrical activity could generate such coherent, meaningful, and often life-altering experiences remain stubbornly resistant to conventional neuroscientific explanation. Researchers have proposed various physiological mechanisms, including the release of endogenous compounds such as dimethyltryptamine or endorphins, the activation of specific neural pathways during hypoxia, or the triggering of dissociative states as protective responses to trauma. And while these explanations account for certain aspects of near-death experiences, such as the sensation of floating or the perception of light, they struggle to adequately explain the specificity, consistency, and transformative power of these encounters across disparate populations who had no prior exposure to cultural narratives about what such experiences should contain. What makes near-death experiences particularly puzzling is not merely their neurological origin, but their phenomenological character. The fact that individuals describe accessing information or achieving emotional states that seem to exceed what their brain chemistry alone should permit, and the persistent reports of encountering deceased individuals whose identities the experiencer was unaware of but later verified, or of perceiving events occurring in distant locations during their clinical death. Creating a gap between the subjective report and the available physiological mechanisms. Despite the inability of science to fully encompass these experiences within its current framework, they have become increasingly normalized within both mainstream culture and medical practice. With hospitals now regularly documenting and studying near-death experiences, therapists incorporating them into trauma recovery protocols, and the broader society accepting them as valid psychological phenomena worthy of serious consideration. Even as the fundamental question of how consciousness could operate independently of brain function remains theoretically impossible, yet experientially reported. This normalization of the scientifically inexplicable represents a quiet acknowledgement that reality contains depths that resist reduction to mere neural firing patterns. Yet we continue living as though the mystery has been resolved, accepting near-death experiences as real while simultaneously maintaining frameworks that deny the possibility of their reported mechanisms, creating a strange cultural equilibrium where the impossible is simultaneously acknowledged and ignored. Perhaps nowhere is this contradiction more apparent than in the case of cardiac arrest survivors who report viewing their own resuscitation from above with perfect accuracy, describing the exact placement of defibrillator paddles or overhearing specific conversations among medical staff, details they could not have obtained through normal sensory channels, yet which medical records subsequently confirm, suggesting that something in human consciousness retains a capacity to perceive and remember that persists even when all measurable brain activity has ceased. Yet when we examine these cases with rigorous skepticism, we find ourselves unable to dismiss them as mere confabulation or false memory, for the corroborating details often involve information that was physically unavailable to the unconscious brain, forcing us to confront the possibility that consciousness may possess properties we have yet to adequately theorize or measure, and that the near-death experience may represent not a malfunction of a dying brain, but rather a glimpse of consciousness operating according to principles entirely foreign to our current materialist assumptions. If consciousness indeed operates according to such alternative principles, then the near-death experience becomes not an anomaly to be explained away, but rather a crucial window into the fundamental nature of mind itself, one that challenges us to expand our scientific paradigms beyond the assumption that subjective experience is merely an epiphenomenon of neural activity, and to consider instead that awareness. Imagine that everything we can see, touch, measure, and observe with our most powerful telescopes comprises only about 5% of the universe, while the remaining 95% consists of something we cannot detect, cannot photograph, cannot directly interact with, and fundamentally do not understand. This is the reality of dark matter, a cosmic mystery that has persisted for nearly a century, haunting the calculations of physicists and astronomers who have built an entire framework of modern cosmology around something that may not actually exist in the way we have theorized. When astronomers observed the rotation of galaxies in the 1930s, they noticed something profoundly wrong with the mathematics. The outer regions of galaxies were moving far too quickly based on the visible matter present, defying the gravitational laws that should govern their motion. Rather than questioning whether our understanding of gravity itself needed revision, the scientific community proposed that vast quantities of invisible matter must be present throughout space, holding galaxies together through gravitational force, a substance they named dark matter, and this hypothesis became so thoroughly embedded into cosmological models that it transformed into accepted fact without ever being directly observed. The psychological mechanism that allows this conceptual glitch to persist is the human tendency to preserve existing frameworks rather than rebuild them from foundation, creating an elaborate mathematical architecture where dark matter functions as a placeholder for our ignorance, a cosmic accounting error made permanent. We have spent billions of dollars constructing detectors buried deep within the Earth, shielded from cosmic rays, designed to catch the theoretical particles of dark matter as they drift silently through our planet and our bodies at this very moment. Yet these experiments have consistently failed to detect anything, returning null results year after year, decade after decade, yet the dark matter hypothesis remains central to astrophysics. This represents perhaps the most profound glitch in reality that science has constructed, an invisible substance that comprises most of the universe, whose existence rests entirely on mathematical inconsistencies and circular logic, where we have become so normalized to its presence in our models that proposing alternatives feels radical and unscientific, even though dark matter itself remains the most unscientific element of our current cosmological understanding. Yet when alternative theories like modified Newtonian dynamics emerge to explain the same observations without invoking invisible matter, they face institutional resistance not because of empirical failures, but because they challenge the investment, intellectual, financial, and professional, that the scientific establishment has made in the dark matter framework, revealing how even our most rigorous institutions remain vulnerable to the same cognitive biases that plague human reasoning in every other domain. Perhaps the deepest glitch lies not in dark matter itself, but in our collective unwillingness to admit that the emperor has no clothes, that we have constructed an elaborate mythology to defend a mathematical inconsistency, trading the humility of honest uncertainty for the comfort of an explanation, however invisible and unprovable, that preserves the authority of our existing models and the careers built upon them. And in this way, dark matter becomes a perfect mirror for examining how science itself can calcify into dogma, how the institutions designed to challenge our assumptions can instead become custodians of comfortable fictions, reminding us that the greatest scientific breakthroughs often come not from those who accept the consensus, but from those brave or foolish enough to ask whether the consensus itself might be the glitch. Consider how Galileo's telescope revealed moons orbiting Jupiter, overturning centuries of accepted cosmology, or how Einstein's relativity replaced Newton's certainties. Each represented a willingness to demolish rather than patch, to admit profound error rather than obscure it with mathematical scaffolding, suggesting that our current unwillingness to seriously entertain alternatives to dark matter may represent not the maturity of modern science, but a regression toward the very dogmatism that science was designed to overcome. Yet as long as dark matter remains unfalsifiable, as long as every failed detection simply expands the theoretical parameters of what we're searching for rather than prompting us to reconsider the fundamental premise, we remain trapped in a self-sealing logic that protects itself from refutation, the very antithesis of scientific inquiry, where the hypothesis becomes immune to the very evidence that should test it. This self-sealing quality mirrors the structure of religious belief systems, where faith becomes stronger precisely because it cannot be proven, transforming dark matter from a scientific hypothesis into a modern cosmological theology that demands belief in the invisible as the price of participation. There exists a peculiar state of consciousness that occurs when the human body finds itself caught between the stages of sleep and wakefulness, a liminal space where the mind has begun to stir into awareness while the muscles remain locked in the paralysis that characterizes REM sleep. And during these moments, individuals across cultures and throughout history have reported experiencing the presence of entities, beings that seem to occupy the bedroom alongside them, shadows that move with intention. Figures that press down upon the chest with overwhelming weight, sometimes appearing as dark silhouettes, other times as more defined creatures with eyes that glow or faces twisted into expressions of malice or indifference, and these experiences feel entirely real to those who encounter them, more vivid and genuine than ordinary dreams, with a clarity and sensory intensity that makes the distinction between hallucination and reality collapse entirely. The scientific understanding of this phenomenon is rooted in the mechanics of sleep itself, specifically in the way the brain manages the transition between different sleep stages, and during REM sleep, the brain deliberately paralyses voluntary muscles to prevent the body from acting out dreams, a protective mechanism that has evolved to keep us safe during the night, but occasionally this system becomes desynchronized, and consciousness activates before the paralysis has lifted, creating a state where the mind is fully aware but the body remains immobilized, unable to move, unable to call out, unable to do anything but experience the sensation of complete helplessness. During this state of conscious immobility, the brain does what it has always done when faced with sensory confusion and uncertainty. It generates explanations, it constructs narratives, it creates beings to account for the overwhelming feelings of dread and pressure that accompany the experience. And the specific form these entities take varies by culture, influenced by the folklore and mythology that surrounds each society, the incubus of medieval Europe, the old hag of Newfoundland, the pinion of the Philippines, the backtack of Persian tradition, all entities that press down, that sit upon the sleeper, that create exactly the weight and pressure that consciousness interprets during this state of neurological confusion. What makes sleep paralysis entities particularly fascinating as a glitch in reality is how they persist despite our complete understanding of their mechanism, despite knowing with certainty that they are generated by the brain itself, despite having identified the exact neurological circumstances that produce them. People continue to be terrified by their presence, continue to interpret them as genuinely external. And even those who know the science often find themselves gripped by primal fear when they experience the phenomenon, suggesting that understanding does not dispel the experience, that knowledge alone cannot override the powerful sensation of presence that the brain generates, and there remains something profoundly unsettling about the fact that our own minds can deceive us so thoroughly, can create entities so convincing, can make us feel so certain of a presence that simply does not exist in the way we perceive it. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that sleep paralysis entities represent a failure of our most basic reality testing mechanisms. The very system's evolution equipped us to distinguish genuine threats from imagined ones, and in those moments of paralysis, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that our perception, that subjective experience itself, can be entirely convincing while being completely disconnected from external reality. And yet, in this neurological glitch, lies a profound mirror held up to human consciousness itself. If our brains can fabricate such convincing external presences during sleep paralysis, how many other aspects of our perceived reality might similarly be constructions of neural activity rather than direct apprehensions of an external world? A question that haunts not only neuroscience but philosophy itself, suggesting that the boundary between hallucination and perception may be far more permeable than we typically assume. This dissolution of certainty extends beyond the bedroom. It raises the unsettling possibility that the very mechanisms we rely upon to navigate reality, perception, memory, emotion, might be equally susceptible to manipulation by our own neural architecture, making us all unwitting prisoners of a brain that constructs reality rather than simply receiving it, and suggesting that the entities we encounter in the dark may be less supernatural visitors than uncomfortable reminders of our fundamental epistemic vulnerability. The sleep paralysis entity thus becomes a kind of neurological Rorschach test, where the architecture of our fears and cultural memories projects itself onto the blank canvas of our owl. And misfiring neural circuitry, a phenomenon that suggests consciousness itself, may be less a window onto reality than a projector casting images onto it. In the final hours or days before death, something inexplicable sometimes occurs within the minds of those who have been deeply confused, cognitively absent, or completely unresponsive for months or even years. And this phenomenon is known as terminal lucidity, a sudden and dramatic return to mental clarity that arrives like a brief window opening in the fog of dementia, coma, or severe neurological decline. Families describe watching their loved ones who have been trapped in the locked chambers of Alzheimer's disease or advanced dementia suddenly wake up, suddenly recognize them by name, suddenly ask meaningful questions about their lives, suddenly engage in coherent conversation and laughter, sometimes even making jokes or sharing profound final words with family members gathered at their bedside, and then just as mysteriously as it arrived. This clarity vanishes completely, and the person either passes away or returns to their previous state of profound disconnection and confusion. The medical community has documented hundreds of these cases across nursing homes and hospice facilities, where nurses and doctors have recorded the testimonies of families who swear that their parent who could not recognize them for 5 years suddenly said their name, or their spouse who had been nonverbal for months suddenly held a complete conversation about their decades together, or their child who had been locked in what appeared to be total neurological absence suddenly became present again. Fully conscious, fully aware, and fully themselves. The mechanisms proposed by neuroscience suggest that as the brain approaches death, perhaps some final surge of neurochemical activity, some last desperate firing of neural pathways, some ultimate mobilization of remaining cognitive resources might temporarily override whatever damage or degeneration has accumulated, allowing consciousness to briefly reassert itself across damaged networks and create moments of unexpected restoration. Yet this explanation remains profoundly unsatisfying because terminal lucidity occurs in cases where the damage seems far too severe for any such temporary restoration to be possible. In conditions where the brain tissue itself has been so thoroughly degraded that any return to function should be neurologically impossible, and the clarity that emerges is not partial or fragmented, but often startlingly complete and coherent. The persistence of this phenomenon, documented and redocumented in medical literature, yet still treated as an anomaly rather than a fundamental mystery demanding serious investigation, reveals something peculiar in how we have normalized the unexplainable by filing it away into the category of coincidence or misperception, as though families are simply seeing what they wish to see in the final moments with their dying loved ones. As though the human desire for closure and connection could somehow manufacture the kind of specific, detailed conversations and recognitions that occur during these inexplicable episodes of clarity in the darkest hour before the end. And perhaps what makes terminal lucidity most unsettling is not merely that it happens, but that it suggests consciousness itself may operate according to principles we have not yet grasped, that awareness might persist in ways our instruments cannot measure, or that the mind possesses capacities for restoration that emerge only in the threshold between life and death, leaving us to wonder whether we are witnessing a final neurological spasm or something far stranger. The soul, quite literally, coming home. Families speak of these moments with a quality of certainty that transcends grief, a conviction born not from hope, but from the unmistakable presence of recognition in their loved one's eyes, a clarity so vivid and so anchored in specific shared memories that it cannot be easily dismissed as wishful thinking or neural artifact, suggesting that whatever occurs in terminal lucidity, it arrives as something genuinely perceived rather than merely imagined. Some families report that their loved one's final lucid moments included references to deceased relatives or descriptions of visions they were experiencing, details that could not have been fabricated or remembered from earlier conversation, while others speak of a palpable shift in the room itself, a quality of presence or attention that seemed to extend beyond the individual consciousness returning, as though something larger was moving through that threshold moment, drawing the dying person briefly back into full awareness before carrying them across into whatever lies beyond. In this regard, terminal lucidity may represent not a malfunction of a failing brain, but rather a final calibration, a momentary alignment between the physical and something beyond it, and it is precisely this possibility, this crack in our materialist certainty, that makes the phenomenon so resistant to dismissal and so deserving of genuine scientific curiosity rather than the comfortable skepticism that allows us to look away. Imagine lying in a hospital bed after surgery, suddenly aware that you are floating near the ceiling, looking down at your own motionless body beneath the surgical lights, watching the medical team work below you as if you were a separate observer in the room rather than the person on the operating table. This is the experience reported by countless individuals throughout history and across all cultures, a phenomenon known as an out-of-body experience or OBE, where consciousness appears to detach from the physical form and perceive reality from an impossible vantage point. The person experiencing this describes crystal clarity, heightened awareness, and an overwhelming sense of peace, yet when they return to their body, they carry memories of witnessing their own form from above, of seeing things they logically should not have been able to see while unconscious or anesthetized. Medical professionals have documented these accounts from cardiac patients during near-death events, from individuals undergoing surgery under general anesthesia, and from people in deep meditation or under the influence of certain substances, creating a body of testimony that is remarkably consistent across different populations and time periods. Neuroscientists have investigated these experiences intensely, identifying that specific disruptions in the brain's temporoparietal junction and changes in the vestibular system can produce sensations of detachment from the body, that temporal lobe stimulation can induce feelings of floating or separation from physical form, and that altered states of consciousness can genuinely generate the neurological signatures associated with these experiences. The brain, when stressed or disrupted, appears capable of constructing a convincing illusion of displacement, a third-person perspective of oneself that feels absolutely real to the person experiencing it, yet contradicts the basic architecture of human perception and awareness. And yet, despite the neurological explanations, despite understanding the mechanisms by which these experiences are generated, individuals continue to report specific details observed during OBEs that they could not have known, continue to describe accurate events from positions they could not physically occupy, and continue to find the experiences profoundly meaningful in ways that pure hallucination does not typically explain. We have integrated out-of-body experiences into our hospitals, our research institutions, and our understanding of consciousness itself, treating them as both genuine neurological phenomena and curious artifacts of altered brain states simultaneously. Somehow accepting that consciousness might genuinely separate while also knowing this should be impossible. A contradiction we have grown comfortable leaving entirely unresolved in the space between what we can measure and what we cannot. Perhaps this unresolved contradiction is itself the most honest position we can occupy, acknowledging that a patient who watches surgeons repair their heart from a vantage point near the ceiling, then accurately describes the specific instrument placed on the sterile field, has experienced something that our current frameworks cannot fully encompass, something that demands we remain intellectually humble about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the body. Perhaps the most profound lesson is not whether these experiences are real in a neurological sense, but rather that they reveal the limits of our current ability to locate consciousness itself, that a phenomenon can be simultaneously explainable by brain science and genuinely anomalous, and that this duality itself may be pointing us toward a more sophisticated understanding of what consciousness actually is and how it relates to physical matter. Until we can answer whether consciousness is produced by the brain or merely filtered through it, out-of-body experiences will continue to occupy this liminal space, neither fully explicable nor fully dismissible, forcing us to question whether our materialist assumptions about mind and body are as complete as we believe them to be. The accounts of verified details, a patient describing a rare surgical instrument they had never seen, another recalling a conversation in an adjacent operating room, suggest that something beyond mere neural simulation may be occurring, even if we lack the conceptual vocabulary to describe it. What remains certain is that out-of-body experiences have become one of consciousness study's most productive mysteries, a phenomenon that refuses to fit neatly into either the materialist or the transcendent frameworks we have constructed, and in that refusal, it teaches us that the deepest questions about human experience may require us to expand our definitions of what counts as evidence and what counts as real. In this way, out-of-body experiences function as a mirror reflecting back to us the incompleteness of our current scientific paradigms, inviting us not toward credulous acceptance, but toward a more rigorous exploration of consciousness that does not prematurely foreclose possibilities simply because. Consider the moment when you think of someone you haven't spoken to in months, and within hours they call you, or you receive an unexpected message from them. And in that instant, your mind crystallizes around the idea that you somehow knew this was going to happen, that you possessed an inexplicable foreknowledge of an event that had not yet occurred, and you replay the memory of your thought backward through time. Convinced that you experienced a genuine premonition rather than a coincidence that your brain has retroactively assigned meaning to. This phenomenon occurs across virtually all human cultures and time periods, from ancient oracles consulting animal entrails to modern individuals claiming to have dreamed the lottery numbers or sensed that a loved one was in danger at the precise moment an accident occurred miles away. The persistence of premonitory experiences, or at least the conviction that they are real, represents one of the most subtle and pervasive glitches in how human consciousness processes probability, memory, and causality. The mechanism underlying most reported premonitions involves what psychologists term confirmation bias combined with the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, a cognitive process wherein the brain selectively remembers instances where an intuition appeared to come true while systematically forgetting the countless times similar hunches led nowhere, creating an illusion of predictive accuracy that never actually existed in any measurable sense. When you recall having felt inexplicably sad or uneasy on the morning of a day that later brought bad news, your mind performs an elegant retrograde rewiring of that emotion, transforming a vague uneasiness that you experience for reasons you cannot articulate into a purposeful signal from some deeper knowing self, even though identical feelings of uneasiness on other mornings preceded nothing but ordinary days. The human brain operates within a timeline that it experiences as linear and unidirectional, yet it simultaneously harbors the capacity to feel and believe that it occasionally escapes this constraint. That information about future events somehow leaks backward through the barrier of the present moment and arrives in consciousness as intuition, a hunch, a vivid dream, or simply an inexplicable conviction. What remains genuinely strange is not whether premonitions are real in any testable or scientific sense, because controlled experiments examining claimed precognitive abilities have consistently failed to demonstrate effects beyond random chance. but rather why the human mind continues to generate and accept these experiences with such confidence, why we structure our narratives to accommodate them, and why even those of us who understand the cognitive mechanisms at work still occasionally feel that prickle of certainty that we somehow knew what was coming, as if the very act of understanding the illusion does not fundamentally dissolve it, but merely layers understanding atop an experience that persists in feeling genuinely inexplicable. Perhaps this persistence reveals something equally important, that the human need to feel connected to patterns, to sense ourselves as agents capable of perceiving invisible threads in the fabric of events, runs so deep that it survives even our conscious acknowledgement of its illusory nature, and we continue to cherish these moments of apparent prescience, not because we believe them to be literally true, but because they offer a temporary reprieve from the randomness and opacity of existence. In this sense, premonitions function less as windows into the future and more as windows into our fundamental hunger for meaning. The recognition that we would rather feel mysteriously prescient than randomly fortunate, that the narrative of having sensed something beforehand grants us a kind of agency, and understanding that pure chance denies us, even when that agency is entirely retroactive and constructed in memory rather than genuinely predictive. And perhaps this is why the most powerful premonitions are those we never speak aloud until after they come true. The unshared intuition carries a purity of meaning that survives scrutiny in a way that publicly declared predictions cannot, allowing us to maintain the illusion indefinitely because no one else was present to count the times we felt certain about something that never materialized. This silence around our failed premonitions becomes its own form of evidence in our minds. The unwitnessed intuition transforms into something almost sacred, a private knowledge that requires no external validation because its truth exists entirely in the realm of feeling, where the distinction between genuine foresight and beautifully constructed memory has never truly mattered. Yet this impulse toward private prophecy may ultimately reveal something even more fundamental. That consciousness itself seems to require the sensation of having touched something beyond itself. And that the experience of meaning, whether retroactively constructed or genuinely prescient, matters more to our sense of self than the metaphysical status of that meaning could ever. Imagine standing outside during a thunderstorm, watching the sky fracture with lightning, when suddenly a glowing sphere of pure energy materializes before you, hovering silently in the air with no visible means of support, drifting slowly across the landscape, as if obeying some invisible current before vanishing without a trace, leaving witnesses entirely bewildered and questioning whether what they experienced was real or a trick of their storm-addled minds. Ball lightning represents one of the most persistent atmospheric phenomena that defies conventional explanation, appearing as a luminous orb ranging in size from a tennis ball to several meters in diameter, typically manifesting during thunderstorms, though occasionally occurring without any obvious electrical activity overhead, and sometimes penetrating indoors through windows or chimneys, leaving scorched marks and inexplicable damage in its wake. Eyewitness accounts describe brilliant colors, including deep reds, yellows, blues, and whites, with some observers reporting a hissing or crackling sound, while others mention a distinct smell of sulfur or ozone permeating the air as the sphere moves with purposeful yet unpredictable motion. The scientific community remains fundamentally divided on what ball lightning actually is, with competing theories ranging from plasma formations to silicon-based chemical reactions to exotic states of matter we have not yet properly categorized or understood. What makes ball lightning so conceptually troubling is that it seems to violate fundamental principles we believe we understand about energy distribution and electrical discharge. Yet thousands of credible witnesses throughout history have documented its appearance with remarkable consistency in their descriptions, suggesting something genuine is occurring rather than mass hallucination or misidentification. The persistence of ball lightning in our collective experience, despite our inability to reliably recreate it in laboratories or fully explain its mechanisms, represents a profound gap between what we observe in nature and what our current theoretical frameworks allow us to comprehend. We have normalized this inexplicability by compartmentalizing ball lightning as a rare phenomenon rather than confronting what its existence might mean about the limits of our understanding, continuing our daily lives while this glowing enigma occasionally reminds us that the natural world still contains mysteries we cannot account for. Perhaps the most humbling aspect is that ball lightning may not be a single phenomenon at all, but rather multiple distinct processes that produce superficially similar effects, meaning our search for a unified explanation might itself be preventing us from recognizing several different mysteries hiding beneath one familiar name. This possibility that ball lightning might be a convenient umbrella term obscuring rather than illuminating suggests that our very language and categorical thinking may be constraining how we investigate atmospheric phenomena, leaving us perpetually chasing a unified answer to a question that nature may have already answered multiple times over in ways we lack the conceptual framework to recognize. Until we develop methods to observe and measure ball lightning in its natural state, rather than attempting to force it into existence within laboratory constraints, we may continue to speak past the phenomenon itself, describing our theories about what it should be rather than what it actually is when it materializes unbidden in a storm-darkened sky. And yet, in that moment when a witness watches a glowing sphere drift silently past their window during a summer storm, the question of theoretical frameworks becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is the undeniable reality of the experience itself, a direct encounter with something that exists whether or not science has adequately named it. That immediacy of witnessing, the sensory reality of light and sound and movement, becomes the only empirical data that truly matters, a reminder that some mysteries reveal themselves not through controlled experimentation, but through the humbling experience of standing before nature in its most enigmatic moments, forever changed by what we cannot explain. The storm passes, the sphere dissipates into darkness, and we return to our ordinary lives carrying only memory and uncertainty. Yet that encounter fundamentally alters how we perceive the boundary between the known and unknown, making us forever aware that the universe reserves the right to present us with phenomena that exist entirely outside the neat categories we have constructed to contain it. Perhaps this is why ball lightning has become a kind of litmus test for intellectual humility. Those who encounter it are forced to acknowledge that wonder and mystery remain possible even in our age of scientific certainty, and that bearing witness to the unexplained may be just as valuable as possessing complete understanding. On August 15, 1977, a radio telescope at Ohio State University's Big Ear Observatory was scanning the sky for extraterrestrial signals when something extraordinary happened, or perhaps something that never happened at all, depending on how you interpret the evidence that remains. A narrow band signal was detected coming from the constellation Chi Sagittarii, and it was so unusual, so remarkably organized and intentional in its characteristics, that the astronomer Jerry Amon, who was reviewing the printed data, circled the signal's designation and wrote the word "wow" in the margin of the computer printout, a reaction of pure astonishment that would ultimately become the permanent name for one of the most tantalizing mysteries in the history of radio astronomy. The signal lasted for 72 seconds, which is an extraordinarily precise window of time, and it arrived with a strength that indicated it could only have come from an artificial source given its narrow bandwidth and frequency of 1420 MHz. The hydrogen line frequency that many scientists theorized an advanced civilization might choose to broadcast on because of its universal significance to physics and chemistry. What makes the WOW signal so persistently unsettling is not merely that we received it once and never heard from that source again, but that despite decades of listening with increasingly sophisticated equipment, despite pointing our most powerful telescopes back at that same region of sky hundreds of times, we have never detected anything remotely like it again, creating a scenario where we must either accept that we genuinely made contact with an extraterrestrial transmission, or confront the deeply uncomfortable possibility that we detected an anomaly we cannot explain, a gap in our scientific framework that defies categorization. The psychological mechanism underlying our obsession with the WOW signal operates on a fundamental human principle: the power of incompleteness, the way our minds refuse to accept unresolved patterns or unanswered questions, particularly when those questions involve the profound possibility of not being alone in the universe. When we receive a signal that appears intentional, our brains immediately engage in pattern recognition, assigning meaning to the data and constructing narratives around incomplete information, transforming a 72-second anomaly into a potential message from another world, a beacon that might represent the most important discovery in human history. The signal's single occurrence and subsequent silence paradoxically makes it more compelling rather than less so, because it preserves the possibility of significance while removing the possibility of verification. and this liminal space between confirmation and dismissal has allowed the wow signal to maintain its cultural and scientific relevance for nearly 50 years without ever becoming either fully proven or entirely disproven. What persists about the wow signal phenomenon is precisely this state of permanent uncertainty, a glitch in our scientific consensus that we have learned to live with despite its logical inconsistency, because the alternative would require us to either claim definitive contact with extraterrestrial intelligence based on a single observation we cannot replicate, or to declare that advanced civilization and their communications simply do not exist within our detection range. Neither of which feels entirely satisfying or true, and so the wow signal remains suspended in our cultural consciousness as a reminder that the universe is still capable of surprising us, of delivering mysteries that resist the neat categorical systems we have constructed to understand reality itself. Perhaps this is precisely why the wow signal endures in our collective memory, while countless other astronomical anomalies fade into obscurity. It occupies the rare intersection of scientific legitimacy and genuine mystery, a moment where our instruments detected something real, but our understanding reached its limit, leaving us suspended between the rational demand for evidence and the deeply human need to believe that somewhere in the vast darkness, someone or something is trying to reach us. And in that liminal space between signal and silence, between the rational and the hopeful, we find ourselves still listening, still watching the same patch of sky, still unable to fully accept that some questions might never yield their answers, still unwilling to surrender the possibility that the wow signal represents not a dead end, but merely the first word in a conversation we have yet to learn how to continue. The listening continues at radio observatories around the world, each scan of the cosmos a quiet act of faith that defies the statistical improbability of detection, a deliberate choice to remain open to contact even as decades accumulate without confirmation, transforming what began as a single moment of astonishment into a sustained posture of hopeful vigilance that may ultimately tell us more about ourselves, about our capacity for wonder and our refusal to accept cosmic solely. Imagine waking up one morning to find that a part of your body no longer exists, and yet you can still feel it moving, itching, aching, and responding to your intentions as though it were still there, tangible and whole. This is the experience of phantom limb syndrome, one of the most deeply unsettling glitches in the architecture of human perception and embodied consciousness, affecting millions of people who have undergone amputation or experienced severe nerve damage that severs the connection between a limb and the central nervous system. Patients report sensations that range from mild tingling to excruciating pain, from the feeling of the phantom limb being in an uncomfortable position to the uncanny sensation of phantom fingers moving through empty air, or phantom toes curling within a void that should contain nothing. The phenomenon persists not as a hallucination or a psychological delusion, but as a genuine neurological experience, documented across centuries and every culture where amputations have occurred, suggesting that this is not a modern malfunction, but rather a fundamental feature of how the brain constructs the body and maintains its internal map of physical existence. When a limb is amputated, the nerve endings that once carried sensory information continue to send signals upward through the spinal cord to the brain, and the brain, confronted with these incoming messages from tissue that no longer exists, responds by activating neural pathways that were previously dedicated to processing sensation from that missing limb, effectively hallucinating the limb back into existence within the landscape of perception. The brain's body map, built through decades of sensory experience and motor control, does not simply erase itself when the physical limb disappears, and instead continues to maintain its representation of that limb in the somatosensory cortex, the region responsible for mapping the body's surface and position in space. This phenomenon becomes even more perplexing when we consider that individuals with phantom limbs often report being unable to move the phantom limb into certain positions, as though it were locked in a particular configuration, or that they experience phantom pain in the exact location where the physical limb experienced pain just before the amputation. Some patients describe the phantom limb as gradually shrinking over time, telescoping inward toward the point of amputation until it eventually disappears, while others report that their phantom limb remains stable and persistent for years or even decades, never fading or diminishing in vividness. The brain seems to be caught in a state of denial, unable or unwilling to accept the reality that this limb no longer exists. And this denial is not something that conscious effort or logical reasoning can overcome. For the sensation of the phantom limb persists even in individuals who are fully aware that they have been amputated and understand completely that the limb cannot possibly still be there. Scientists have discovered that phantom pain can sometimes be alleviated through mirror therapy, a technique in which the patient places their remaining limb in front of a mirror, positioned to create the illusion that the phantom limb is still attached and visible, and then performs movements while watching the reflection, effectively tricking the brain into accepting that the limb has returned. And through this visual feedback and motor engagement, the phantom sensations sometimes diminish or resolve entirely. This discovery suggests that the phantom limb exists not as a fixed neural scar or a permanent rewiring, but rather as a dynamic process of perception that can be influenced and shifted through sensory input. Yet the fact that such elaborate tricks are necessary to convince the brain of a simple physical reality demonstrates how powerfully the brain's internal model of the body can override actual sensory data and environmental facts. We move through the world wrapped in this body map, this internal representation of ourselves that the brain constructs and maintains through constant sensory updating. And yet when the actual body changes in a fundamental way, this map often refuses to update, clinging to its old configuration and insisting that parts of us still exist when they objectively do not, reminding us that the body we feel ourselves inhabiting is not the body that exists in physical space, but rather a constructed narrative that the brain tells itself, a story that sometimes continues long after the plot has changed. And perhaps this is the deeper lesson that phantom limb syndrome teaches us, that we are never truly in direct contact with physical reality, but always experiencing a version of ourselves mediated through the brain's interpretation, a model that can persist in its old patterns even when contradicted by the world, suggesting that all of our sensory experience, not just phantom limbs, might be a kind of controlled hallucination, a story the brain tells itself about what exists, and that when this story diverges from reality, we discover just how little we truly know about the realm. Throughout human history, there exist countless documented instances where two or more individuals report experiencing the same dream on the same night, complete with matching details, identical settings, recurring characters, and even the same sequence of events, despite having no conscious communication or prior agreement to attempt such a phenomenon. And despite the fact that modern neuroscience has found no plausible mechanism by which the electrical and chemical activity occurring within one person's brain could somehow transmit to or influence the brainwaves of another person at a distance. When couples who have been together for many years describe waking up and immediately sharing their dreams, only to discover they both dreamed of the same house, the same conversation, or the same symbolic scenario, they report a sense of profound connection and synchronicity, as though their minds had somehow touched in a realm beyond the physical body. Yet neuroscientists would argue that such occurrences are merely coincidence amplified by the human brain's extraordinary ability to recognize patterns and find meaning in random data. The psychological explanation typically offered is that people in close relationships develop similar thought patterns, anxieties, and preoccupations throughout their waking lives, and therefore the symbolic content that emerges from their subconscious minds during REM sleep might naturally overlap in theme and narrative, even if the specific details were generated independently by each dreamer's sleeping brain. There exists also the possibility of suggestion and false memory reconstruction, wherein one person's description of their dream subtly plants ideas into another person's mind, which then become woven into their own recalled dream narrative through the contamination of memory that occurs in the brief moments after waking when consciousness is still hazy and malleable. Yet despite these rational explanations, the phenomenon persists in human experience and human testimony, and people continue to report these experiences with remarkable consistency across cultures and centuries, speaking of them in hushed tones as though they have witnessed something that science cannot quite capture or explain away. The strangeness deepens when we consider that there is no way to verify whether a shared dream truly occurred or whether it is simply a convincing coincidence paired with the power of suggestion and emotional investment in the relationship. And yet this fundamental unfalsifiability does not diminish the subjective reality and the emotional impact of the experience for those who report it, suggesting that some aspects of human consciousness may operate in ways that resist our current scientific frameworks and measurement tools. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that shared dreams reveal something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself, that the mind, in its deepest sleeping state, may operate according to principles that transcend the boundaries we assume separate one individual from another, and that the documented experiences of countless dreamers across time might be pointing toward a dimension of human connection that our waking instruments have simply not yet learned to measure. In this sense, the shared dream becomes not a puzzle to be solved through reductionist analysis, but rather an invitation to expand our understanding of what consciousness is, and how it might connect us to one another in ways that our current language and instruments can barely begin to articulate, leaving us with the humbling recognition that the most intimate experiences of human connection may ultimately transcend the categories through which we attempt to understand them. And perhaps this is why lovers who share dreams speak of them not as curiosities to be explained, but as confirmations of a bond that exists beyond the reach of neuroscience, a validation that two souls, however briefly and mysteriously, have managed to meet in the same nocturnal landscape, leaving each person with the indelible sense that they have been truly known. In cultures where dreams are honored as gateways to spiritual truth rather than dismissed as mere neural noise, shared dreams have long been understood as evidence of a deeper reality, one where the boundaries between self and other become permeable, and where love itself might be the language through which two consciousnesses recognize their fundamental unity, transforming sleep from an escape from the world into an encounter with its deepest mysteries. In indigenous traditions spanning from Aboriginal Australia to the Amazon, the dream realm has been treated as a shared territory where ancestors, living relatives, and even strangers can encounter one another with the same validity as waking meetings, suggesting that what modern psychology dismisses as subjective fantasy may have been understood by cultures with different epistemologies as a legitimate form of communication that operates outside the constraints of linear time and individual neural isolation. Consider a moment when you learn a new word, perhaps a word you have never encountered before in your entire life, and then within days or even hours you begin to see that word everywhere around you, appearing in conversations, on billboards, in articles you read, and in television programs you watch, creating an uncanny sensation that the universe has suddenly become obsessed with this particular term and is conspiring to place it directly in your path at every possible opportunity. This is the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also known as frequency illusion or the recency illusion, and it represents one of the most pervasive yet invisible distortions of our perception that affects nearly everyone who has ever paid attention to the world around them. The experience begins innocently enough when something captures your awareness for the first time, perhaps through a conversation with a friend, a book recommendation, or a chance encounter with an unfamiliar concept. And from that moment forward, your mind becomes primed to recognize this stimulus wherever it appears. What makes this phenomenon so remarkable is that the frequency of the stimulus has not actually increased at all, yet our subjective experience of encountering it multiplies dramatically, creating a powerful illusion that reality itself has shifted to accommodate our newfound awareness. The psychological mechanism underlying this glitch involves two interconnected cognitive processes: selective attention and confirmation bias, working together in a seamless partnership that transforms our perception without our conscious knowledge or consent. Once something enters your conscious awareness, your brain automatically adjusts its filtering systems to flag instances of that thing whenever they appear in your environment. And because your attention is now directed toward recognizing this pattern, you notice every occurrence while remaining blissfully unaware that you are actively ignoring countless other patterns that never capture your notice. This selective attention operates like an invisible spotlight, illuminating certain aspects of reality while simultaneously casting everything else into shadow. And we rarely acknowledge the profound role this mechanism plays in determining what we perceive as real and significant. Furthermore, confirmation bias amplifies this effect by causing you to remember and focus on instances where you encountered the stimulus while forgetting the countless times you failed to notice it, or when it was completely absent from your environment. Your brain becomes so attuned to confirming the pattern that you have recognized that it actively seeks out evidence supporting the phenomenon while discarding evidence that contradicts it, creating a feedback loop where the illusion strengthens itself through repeated psychological reinforcement. What makes the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon particularly unsettling is that understanding its mechanisms does not diminish its power over our perception. And even knowing exactly how selective attention and confirmation bias work together to create this illusion, we remain helpless to prevent it from occurring. We have learned to name this glitch, to explain it, to document it, and to discuss it at length, yet it continues to operate with undiminished force in our daily lives, suggesting that some distortions in our perception are so fundamentally woven into the architecture of human consciousness that mere knowledge of their existence cannot eradicate them. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon persists as a gentle reminder that our experience of reality is not a direct perception of the world as it actually exists, but rather a constructed narrative generated by our own minds, filtered through our attention, shaped by our biases, and reflected through the lens of our prior experiences and expectations. This recognition should humble us, for it suggests that the objective world and our subjective experience of it exist in fundamentally different dimensions, and what we call seeing is really an act of creation, where our minds actively author the reality we inhabit rather than passively recording what exists around us. In this sense, the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon becomes a metaphor for the broader human condition. We are not passive observers of a fixed reality, but active participants in an endless process of meaning-making, where our consciousness collaborates with the world to determine what deserves our attention and what remains forever invisible in the periphery of our awareness. Perhaps this is why the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon feels so intimate and personal. It reveals that the universe we experience is not merely observed, but co-created through the act of paying attention, and in noticing what we notice, we are simultaneously discovering and inventing the world that we inhabit. When you finally recognize this pattern, that your awareness shapes what becomes real to you, you begin to understand why. Two people can walk through the identical street and return with entirely different stories about what they witnessed, each equally convinced of the truth of their own Consider the sheer mathematical improbability woven into the fabric of our cosmic understanding, a contradiction so profound that it has haunted the minds of physicists and philosophers for decades, known as the Fermi Paradox, named after the Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, who posed a deceptively simple question during lunch in 1950 that would echo through generations. If the universe is so incomprehensibly vast, containing billions upon billions of galaxies, each harboring hundreds of billions of stars, and if the formation of life is not some miraculous singular event, but rather a natural consequence of chemistry and time, then where exactly is everybody? The mathematics seem almost cruelly straightforward. The probability calculations suggest that intelligent civilizations should be scattered throughout the cosmos like grains of sand on an infinite beach. Yet when we turn our most sophisticated instruments toward the heavens and listen intently for signals, for radio broadcasts, for any indication whatsoever of extraterrestrial intelligence, we encounter only silence. An overwhelming and unsettling silence that contradicts everything our statistical models predict should exist. The psychological mechanism underlying our relationship with this paradox is fundamentally one of cognitive dissonance, a deep uncomfortable tension between what logic tells us must be true and what our observations stubbornly insist is not, creating a kind of intellectual vertigo where the absence of something we expect becomes somehow more terrifying than its presence would be. We have constructed elaborate theoretical frameworks to resolve this contradiction, proposing that perhaps intelligent life self-destructs before achieving the technological capability for interstellar communication, or that civilizations go through brief windows of broadcasting before preferring radio silence, or that the vast distances between stars create an impenetrable barrier to any meaningful contact, or most unsettling of all, that we are somehow fundamentally alone in ways that our mathematics cannot accommodate. Yet despite having constructed these numerous explanations, each addressing different aspects of the paradox while failing to fully resolve it, we continue to exist in a peculiar state of normalized bewilderment, conducting our scientific searches through programs like the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, while simultaneously accepting the overwhelming likelihood that no answer will ever arrive, that the universe may indeed be functionally empty of our cosmic neighbors. This persistence of the paradox, despite our logical attempts to dispel it, reflects something deeper about our relationship with uncertainty, our tendency to construct elaborate explanations for mysteries while never quite achieving the closure we seek, leaving us suspended in a state of perpetual incompleteness, where the absence of extraterrestrial life remains perhaps the most eloquent statement the universe has made to us. Perhaps this silence itself becomes the data point we should examine most carefully, suggesting that the Fermi Paradox may not be a problem requiring a solution, but rather a mirror reflecting our own assumptions about what intelligence, communication, and civilization necessarily entail, forcing us to confront the possibility that our frameworks for understanding existence may be as limited as our ability to hear voices calling across the darkness. In this light, the Fermi Paradox transforms from a question about alien civilizations into a profound inquiry about the nature of consciousness itself. Whether intelligence inevitably develops along paths we recognize, or whether the universe might be teeming with minds operating according to principles so alien to our own that we lack even the conceptual vocabulary to identify them as conscious at all. The silence we hear, then, may not be the absence of life, but rather the sound of the cosmos speaking in languages we have not yet learned to comprehend. And perhaps this humbling recognition, that our silence may be less a cosmic emptiness than a failure of perception, invites us to listen not just with radio telescopes, but with the intellectual humility to admit that consciousness itself might manifest in forms so distant from our own that a civilization of crystalline networks or quantum-entangled collectives would be as invisible to us as we might be to them, existing in parallel to our reality. Separated not by the vast gulfs of space, but by the even vaster gulf of incompatible ontologies. This recognition demands we expand our epistemological humility beyond the merely cosmic, acknowledging that the Fermi Paradox ultimately reveals less about the universe's emptiness and more about the boundaries of human perception, suggesting that our search for extraterrestrial intelligence may be fundamentally constrained by our inability to imagine minds that do not think as we do, communicate as we do, or value connection in ways we recognize as meaningful. Consider the moment when observation fundamentally alters reality itself, when the act of looking at something changes what that something actually is, a phenomenon that quantum physicists have named wave function collapse, and understand that this is not metaphorical or poetic language, but rather a description of what appears to happen at the quantum level of existence where particles exist in superposition, in multiple states simultaneously. Until the precise instant that a measurement or observation occurs, at which point the wave function collapses into a single definite state, transforming probability into actuality through the sheer act of paying attention. The mechanism itself challenges our most basic assumptions about how reality works because it suggests that before observation, a particle genuinely has no determined properties, no fixed location, no specific momentum, but rather exists as a cloud of probability, a mathematical abstraction floating in potential space. And only when we look, when we measure, when we direct our consciousness or our instruments toward it, does it snap into existence with concrete properties that we can then observe and record and verify. This creates a deeply unsettling philosophical problem that has haunted physics for nearly a century, because it implies that the universe does not have an independent existence separate from observation, that reality at its most fundamental level is not objective, but rather dependent on the act of measurement, dependent on consciousness itself perhaps, or at least dependent on the interaction between the observer and the observed. A relationship that seems to violate everything we believe about how the world should function. Yet despite this fundamental weirdness, this apparent violation of logical consistency, we have simply normalized it, integrated it into our scientific understanding, taught it in universities, built quantum computers based on these principles, and moved forward as though this is simply how nature works, accepting that at the smallest scales of reality, existence itself operates according to rules that seem to deny the possibility of an objective world independent of measurement. And we do this because the equations work, because the predictions prove accurate, because the technology functions, and because after decades of debate and countless experiments and philosophical arguments, no one has come up with a better explanation for why quantum mechanics behaves this way, so we have collectively decided to live with this impossible situation, to embrace this glitch in the fabric of reality that makes consciousness seem to play an active role in creating the physical world. To accept that observation and reality are not separate things, but are instead fundamentally intertwined in ways that our intuition tells us should not be possible. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of wave function collapse, not that reality is strange, but that our confidence in what we mean by observation and existence was always built on assumptions we never properly examined, and that the universe's refusal to conform to our intuitions might be telling us something profound about the limits of our understanding rather than revealing some cosmic dependence on the observer's gaze. Perhaps the most humbling aspect is that we have built our entire technological civilization on quantum mechanics, while remaining genuinely uncertain about what it actually means, suggesting that understanding how to use nature's rules may be fundamentally different from understanding why those rules exist in the first place. A distinction that should make us cautious about claiming we have solved the mystery rather than merely learned to live productively within it. This same humility might extend to other domains where we confidently apply our tools without fully understanding their foundations, from artificial intelligence systems that make consequential decisions through mechanisms we cannot fully interpret, to medicine where we deploy treatments that work without comprehending all the biological pathways involved, to economics where models predict behavior based on assumptions about human nature that may be fundamentally flawed. Suggesting that technological mastery and conceptual understanding are not the same thing, and that our species may be quite skilled at building things that work while remaining perpetually confused about why. And in this gap between utility and understanding lies a peculiar vulnerability. We construct increasingly powerful systems based on principles we don't fully comprehend, betting that nature's consistency will hold even as we push into domains where our foundational assumptions have never been tested, a wager that has served us well so far but remains, at its core, an act of faith dressed in the language of empiricism. This faith becomes especially precarious when we consider that wave function collapse itself remains unso. Elved, we still cannot definitively say whether consciousness plays a role, whether the universe is fundamentally indeterminate, or whether some hidden mechanism we have yet. In the small town of Taos, New Mexico, located in the high desert where the mountains meet vast open plains, residents and visitors have reported experiencing an inexplicable low-frequency humming sound that seems to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, a phenomenon that has persisted for decades without definitive explanation or resolution, despite countless investigations by acoustic engineers, scientists, and government agencies who have attempted to locate its source. The sound is described by those who hear it as a deep, rhythmic drone that ranges between 40 and 80 hertz, barely perceptible to some people but absolutely maddening to others, causing sleep disturbances, anxiety, and a persistent sense of unease that can drive individuals to abandon their homes or move away from the region entirely in search of silence that they can no longer find in their familiar surroundings. The phenomenon first gained widespread attention in the 1990s when local residents began reporting their experiences publicly, leading to newspaper articles and scientific inquiries that ultimately generated more questions than answers, as researchers discovered that the hum could not be consistently recorded on audio equipment despite being clearly audible to many witnesses, suggesting that whatever mechanism produces this sound operates on a frequency or through a medium that standard recording technology cannot adequately capture or document for later analysis and verification. Theories regarding the hum's origin have ranged from the plausible to the extraordinary, including vibrations from underground geological activity, electromagnetic radiation from power lines or military installations, low-frequency industrial equipment from distant facilities, or even the Earth's own magnetic field manifesting as an audible phenomenon under specific atmospheric conditions that create rare acoustic anomalies. Some researchers have proposed that certain individuals possess heightened sensitivity to infrasound, frequencies below the normal range of human hearing that can nevertheless be perceived by the body as vibrations or pressure changes, which would explain why some residents hear the hum constantly while others in the same location report complete silence and skepticism about its existence. Psychological explanations have also been offered, suggesting that once the phenomenon becomes known within a community, the power of suggestion and the human brain's remarkable ability to create sensory experiences through expectation and belief can cause people to perceive and interpret ambient sounds in ways that reinforce the narrative of an unexplained phenomenon, essentially generating a self-perpetuating cycle of confirmation and shared experience that becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish from objective reality. What remains striking about the Taos hum is not merely its persistence, but the degree to which it has resisted comprehensive scientific explanation despite numerous investigations and the application of modern acoustic technology and geological analysis that has successfully explained virtually every other environmental mystery of the modern era. The hum continues to exist in a peculiar liminal space where it is simultaneously real to those who experience it, undeniably present in their daily lives and deeply affecting their well-being, yet impossible to fully document or definitively trace to any singular source in ways that satisfy both the experiencers and the skeptics simultaneously. This unresolved quality, this gap between subjective certainty and objective verification, represents a fascinating glitch in our modern understanding of reality and our assumption that advanced technology and scientific methodology can ultimately illuminate and resolve any mystery presented to us. The Taos Hum thus stands as a humbling reminder that mystery persists even in our age of unprecedented technological capability, and that some phenomena may ultimately reveal as much about the limitations of human perception and scientific methodology as they do about the world itself. For the residents of Taos who continue to hear the sound night after night, the lack of official explanation matters far less than the undeniable reality of their experience, suggesting that truth itself may exist in multiple forms simultaneously, scientific and subjective, measurable and intensely personal. In this way, the Taos Hum exemplifies how modern mysteries often refuse to conform to the binary categories of solved or unsolved, instead occupying a more nuanced territory where lived experience and scientific inquiry operate according to different rules and measure success by incompatible standards. Perhaps the hum's greatest significance lies not in eventually determining its cause, but in what it teaches us about accepting ambiguity as a permanent feature of human existence rather than merely a temporary obstacle to our standing. Imagine standing in a laboratory where the very foundation of how time works begins to fracture beneath the weight of experimental evidence, where effects appear to precede their causes in ways that should be fundamentally impossible according to everything we understand about reality, yet the data persists regardless. Retrocausality refers to the troubling phenomenon wherein future events seem to influence past occurrences, a concept that violates our most basic intuitions about temporal order and yet emerges repeatedly from quantum mechanical experiments and theoretical physics frameworks that are otherwise tremendously successful at predicting the behavior of the universe. In the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, photons are sent through a double-slit apparatus where they should create an interference pattern indicating wave-like behavior. Yet when a scientist makes a measurement choice after the photon has already passed through the apparatus, that future measurement appears to retroactively determine whether the photon behaves as a wave or particle at an earlier moment in time. The measurement happens later, yet it seems to reach backward through time to influence what the photon was doing before the measurement even occurred, suggesting that causality does not flow exclusively forward as we experience it. Other experiments in quantum mechanics produce similar reversals of temporal expectation, where information appears to travel backward through time, or where the universe seems to adjust its past behavior based on what happens in the present or future, creating a kind of cosmic consistency where all moments in time work together to maintain logical coherence rather than unfolding in a strictly linear sequence. The psychological mechanism that keeps us comfortable with retrocausality, despite its profound strangeness, operates through a kind of intellectual compartmentalization, where we accept these findings as mathematical abstractions rather than descriptions of actual reality as we experience it. We tell ourselves that this is merely how quantum mechanics works at scales we cannot directly observe, that the mathematics might produce counterintuitive results while still remaining purely theoretical, and that our everyday experience of time moving forward in one direction represents the true nature of reality, while retrocausality remains confined to the laboratory and the chalkboard. Yet the experiments continue to produce these results with consistency and precision, and interpretations of quantum mechanics that incorporate retrocausality, or at least allow for it, have become increasingly mainstream among theoretical physicists, suggesting that either our understanding of time itself requires fundamental revision, or that the universe operates according to principles so alien to human experience that we may never fully grasp them intuitively. We have normalized retrocausality by treating it as a mathematical curiosity rather than a serious challenge to how we understand causality itself, maintaining our sense of temporal order and free will by relegating these impossible occurrences to the quantum realm where intuition has already collapsed. And this willful separation between theoretical possibility and experiential reality allows us to sleep soundly despite living in a universe where the past may genuinely be mutable, and where the future might be constantly reaching backward to reshape what has already supposedly occurred. If we truly accepted retrocausality as fundamental to reality rather than relegating it to theoretical abstractions, we would have to reconsider not merely physics, but the nature of agency itself. Whether our choices in this moment are genuinely free or whether they are already constrained by a future that has been reaching backward through time since before we were born. Collapsing the comfortable illusion of an open future into a predetermined dance where all moments conspire toward a single coherent outcome. This possibility haunts the margins of our scientific understanding, that every decision you believe you are making freely in this moment might already be the echo of a future self reaching backward through time, a cosmic ancestor from a moment yet to come whispering instructions into the past, making your present agency nothing more than the predetermined unfolding of a timeline that has always been complete, waiting only for you to experience its revelation in what you mistakenly call the forward progression of time. And yet we continue to plan for futures we believe we can shape, to make choices as though they matter in the moment of their making, to live as though the arrow of time points forward rather than existing as a completed four-dimensional sculpture, where past and future are equally real and equally immutable, a psychological necessity that allows us to navigate existence without collapsing beneath the weight of cosmic determinism disguised as quantum mecha. Next, imagine a scenario where you are the subject of a thought experiment that sits at the intersection of quantum mechanics and personal consciousness, a theoretical framework that challenges everything we believe about death and the nature of reality itself. The concept of quantum immortality emerges from a peculiar interpretation of quantum mechanics, specifically from the many worlds interpretation, which suggests that every quantum event causes the universe to branch into multiple parallel realities, each representing a different possible outcome of that event. According to this interpretation, when a quantum measurement occurs, the universe does not collapse into a single reality but instead splits into numerous branches, each containing an observer who experiences a different result. Now, apply this principle to a scenario involving your own survival, and you arrive at a deeply unsettling philosophical position. From your personal subjective perspective, you may never experience death at all. The reasoning operates like this, which is admittedly strange to contemplate as you drift towards sleep. Every moment, your continued existence depends on countless quantum events occurring correctly within your body, from the firing of neurons to the functioning of your heart. And if quantum mechanics truly generates branches for every possible outcome, then there must exist some branch of reality in which you survive, no matter how improbable the circumstances. Theoretically, from your internal first-person viewpoint, consciousness would always find itself in the branch where survival occurred, as you cannot observe yourself dead, leading to the haunting conclusion that subjectively, from your perspective alone, you would experience an infinitely long life, forever finding yourself in the improbable branches where you somehow continued breathing, continued thinking, continued existing, even as the statistical likelihood of such survival approaches zero. This creates a deeply paradoxical situation where you, the conscious observer, would experience ever more unlikely and increasingly bizarre circumstances just to stay alive, wandering through realities where recovery from fatal illnesses happens spontaneously, where accidents that should have killed you somehow don't, where your body inexplicably defies entropy and decay. The psychological mechanism underlying this thought experiment is our fundamental inability to imagine genuine non-existence, our incapacity to truly conceptualize what it would be like to not experience anything at all, combined with a misapplication of quantum mechanics to consciousness itself. Yet despite possessing no experimental evidence, despite the lack of any scientific framework that actually supports consciousness selecting quantum branches, despite the fact that neuroscientists have found no mechanism by which subjective experience could interact with quantum decoherence, the idea persists in popular culture and online communities, gaining traction especially in spaces concerned with existential anxiety and the fear of death. We have somehow normalized this speculation, discussed it casually in forums and philosophy circles, treated it as plausible rather than as an abuse of quantum mechanics to satisfy our deepest desire for continuity of self. and it reveals something profound about human psychology. Our desperate unwillingness to accept mortality and our tendency to retrofit scientific concepts, no matter how inappropriately, into frameworks that promise us some form of escape from the finality of death. Perhaps this is why quantum immortality resonates so powerfully in an age of unprecedented uncertainty and mortality salience. It offers us a scientifically flavored narrative where the universe itself becomes a kind of cosmic life support system, forever conspiring to keep consciousness alive, transforming death from an inevitable endpoint into merely an imperceptible transition into increasingly improbable branches of existence. And yet, in clinging to this comforting illusion, we may be avoiding the more liberating truth that mortality is not a bug in the system to be hacked through quantum loopholes, but rather the very condition that makes meaningful choice, genuine love, and authentic experience possible in the first place. The finality of death is what transforms our time into something precious rather than infinite and therefore disposable. When we accept that our days are numbered, we begin to understand why we reach for narratives like quantum immortality in the first place, not because they are true, but because the alternative, a universe genuinely indifferent to our survival, demands a courage that few of us naturally possess. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves, late at night, scrolling through forums dedicated to quantum immortality, seeking reassurance in the mathematics of branching universes, unconsciously hoping that somewhere in the infinite expanse of possibility, why there exists a version of ourselves that never has to say goodbye. Consider the phenomenon of mass hysteria, where large groups of people simultaneously experience physical symptoms or engage in collective behaviors that have no identifiable medical or logical cause, spreading through populations like an invisible contagion that defies conventional explanation and challenges our understanding of how minds and bodies can become synchronized in ways that seem to transcend individual reason. Throughout history, documented cases have emerged from schools, workplaces, and communities where dozens or even hundreds of individuals reported identical symptoms: tremors, paralysis, rashes, or unexplained pain, all appearing within days of each other, yet yielding no pathological evidence when examined by medical professionals who found nothing physically wrong with any of the afflicted individuals. The most compelling aspect of mass hysteria is not the symptoms themselves, but rather the mechanism by which belief and expectation become biological reality, where the mere suggestion that something is happening, combined with the confirmation of that belief from trusted figures in one's social circle, creates a cascade of genuine physiological responses that the body produces almost involuntarily. As though the nervous system itself becomes convinced of a threat that exists only in the collective imagination. Psychological researchers have identified several contributing factors that enable mass hysteria to flourish. Social stress, a shared sense of vulnerability, the presence of a charismatic individual who interprets ambiguous symptoms as evidence of something specific and dangerous, and perhaps most critically, the contagion effect whereby witnessing others display symptoms creates an expectation and framework through which previously unnoticed bodily sensations become interpreted as confirmation of the emerging diagnosis. What remains profoundly unsettling about mass hysteria is how it persists in our modern age despite our vastly superior medical knowledge and diagnostic capabilities, as demonstrated by repeated incidents in schools and offices where clusters of individuals report mysterious illnesses that vanish the moment external validation or alternative explanation is provided. The phenomenon suggests something uncomfortable about human consciousness, that our minds remain fundamentally interconnected through mechanisms we barely comprehend, and that shared belief can override individual skepticism with remarkable power, reminding us that even in an era of scientific certainty, we remain capable of collectively experiencing realities that exist only in the spaces between individual vulnerability and group consensus. Perhaps this reveals that mass hysteria is less a failure of modern rationality than an exposure of how deeply our bodies remain tethered to social meaning, how a symptom is never purely physical, but always already interpreted through the lens of cultural narrative, medical authority, and collective fear, making mass hysteria not an anomaly to be eliminated, but rather a persistent mirror reflecting the stubborn reality that human experience is fundamentally relational and socially constructed at every level. In this light, the documented cases of dancing plagues in medieval Europe, the laughing epidemics of Tanzania, and the more recent instances of mysterious illnesses in schools become not curiosities to dismiss, but eloquent testaments to the permeability of the boundary between individual and collective consciousness, suggesting that our greatest vulnerability to mass hysteria may stem from our deepest need to belong, to have our private suffering witnessed, validated, and transformed into shared meaning within the groups that constitute our identity. This recognition invites a compassionate reframing of mass hysteria not as pathology or delusion, but as a form of collective communication, a language through which groups articulate anxieties that lack conventional channels for expression, transforming private distress into shared symptoms that demand attention and validation from the institutions and communities that might otherwise dismiss individual suffering as mere psychological weakness. In this way, mass hysteria becomes a form of collective testimony, a somatic narrative that insists on being heard when other voices have been silenced. And understanding this dimension of the phenomenon requires us to listen not just to the symptoms themselves, but to the social conditions and systemic neglect that make such collective expression necessary in the first place. The factory worker who develops tremors after a colleague collapses, the student whose throat tightens in sympathy with classmates reporting choking sensations, the nurse who experiences unexplained fatigue as her ward fills with the unspoken dread of contagion. Each becomes, through their body, a messenger for griefs and fears that the institutions surrounding them have failed to adequately acknowledge or digress, transforming individual vulnerability into collective witness. Consider the peculiar sensation that arrives without warning, the unmistakable buzzing against your thigh, or the gentle tremor in your pocket that you have become so accustomed to feeling that your body now manufactures the experience entirely on its own, independent of any actual stimulus or notification waiting to be discovered. You reach down to retrieve your phone with a sense of urgency, your fingers already moving to unlock the device and check the messages you are certain have arrived, only to find the screen dark and silent, the notification log empty, and no evidence whatsoever that anything has actually occurred. This is the phenomenon known as phantom vibrations, a glitch in the interface between expectation and sensation that occurs with remarkable frequency in the modern world, affecting countless individuals who have integrated mobile devices so completely into their daily existence that the boundary between real alerts and imagined ones has become persistently blurred. The experience typically begins after months or years of conditioning, during which you have learned to anticipate vibrations with almost Pavlovian precision, your nervous system primed to detect even the faintest tremor that might indicate an incoming call or message requiring your attention. Your brain, operating on patterns it has internalized through repeated exposure, begins to generate false positives, sending signals that feel identical to genuine vibrations, creating phantom sensations that bypass conscious thought and trigger an automatic reaching response before your rational mind has time to intervene. The mechanism at work involves a combination of heightened attention and what psychologists refer to as pareidolia of sensation, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in ambiguous stimuli, except in this case the stimuli are entirely internal, fabricated by an overactive expectation system that has been trained through constant reinforcement to remain perpetually vigilant. Your nervous system becomes so sensitized to the possibility of vibration that any minor stimulus in that region of your body, whether it is the brush of fabric, a slight shift in position, or even the ambient vibration from nearby machinery or traffic, becomes unconsciously misinterpreted as the specific sensation associated with your phone. What makes this phenomenon particularly remarkable is how it persists despite the complete lack of logical justification. How you continue to experience these phantom vibrations even after having checked your phone dozens of times and found nothing. Yet the false alarms continue to manifest with the same convincing intensity as real notifications. We have normalized this glitch so thoroughly that most people carry their devices in their pockets without ever questioning why they feel constant vibrations that do not exist, why their bodies have learned to hallucinate specific sensations, or why modern technology has trained our nervous systems to maintain a state of perpetual readiness that far exceeds any biological necessity. The phantom vibration persists as a testament to how deeply our expectations have become embedded in our sensory experience, how the mind can override the actual input of the physical world in favor of what it has been conditioned to anticipate, and how a simple device has managed to reprogram something as fundamental as our ability to distinguish between real and imaginary sensations. It represents a quiet glitch in the architecture of human perception, one that we have accepted without resistance or critical examination, allowing our bodies to become unreliable narrators of their own experiences. Yet perhaps most unsettling is the realization that this phenomenon reveals something deeper about consciousness itself, that the boundary between perception and imagination has always been more permeable than we care to admit, and that technology has simply made visible a truth our nervous systems have always known, that we experience not the world as it is, but the world as our expectations have learned to construct it. In this light, phantom vibrations become less a mere quirk of modern life and more a window into the precarious relationship between our biology and our tools, revealing how swiftly our bodies can be colonized by the demands of constant connectivity, how a device designed to alert us to the outside world has instead trained us to manufacture alerts from within, leaving us perpetually uncertain whether the urgency we feel originates from genuine necessity or from the phantom echoes of notifications that never were. And so we remain trapped in this feedback loop, our attention fractured between the device in our pocket and the phantom alerts our bodies conjure, unable to trust our own sensations, checking and rechecking in a ritual that has become so automatic we no longer recognize it as compulsive behavior, only as the ordinary rhythm of contemporary existence. On May 11, 1997, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's underwater microphone arrays detected an extraordinarily loud, low-frequency sound emanating from somewhere in the South Pacific Ocean. A sound so powerful and unusual that it registered on sensors located thousands of miles apart, creating a mystery that would perplex marine biologists and oceanographers for decades to come. The sound itself lasted only about 60 seconds, but during that brief window, it produced acoustic energy that dwarfed the noise signature of even the largest known whales, the blue whales whose calls had previously been considered the loudest vocalizations produced by any living creature on Earth. Yet this underwater boom was distinctly different, distinctly alien, possessing a frequency pattern and duration that seemed almost mechanical in nature, almost artificial. Almost as though something enormous and utterly unknown had announced its presence to the listening world below the waves. The event became known as the Bloop, a name that, while seemingly whimsical, belied the genuine sense of unease that rippled through the scientific community when researchers first analyzed the data, because the origin of the sound could not be immediately identified, and for several years the leading hypothesis among certain researchers was that an unknown gargantuan sea creature, perhaps a leviathan that had somehow escaped human detection despite centuries of ocean exploration, had produced this acoustic phenomenon, a creature so massive and so deep-dwelling that it had remained forever hidden from our instruments and our eyes. The psychological mechanism underlying the persistence of the Bloop mystery within our collective consciousness relates to a deeply human tendency to fill gaps in knowledge with narratives of discovery and the unknown, because the ocean remains largely unexplored, with more than 80% of it unmapped and unobserved, and therefore it exists in our minds as a final frontier, a place where enormous things could theoretically still remain undiscovered, where the rules of the known world might not apply, and where the unexpected might emerge from the darkness below to challenge everything we believe about biology and scale and possibility. Scientists eventually determined that the bloop was most likely caused by the calving of icebergs in Antarctica, the sudden fracturing and breaking apart of massive ice shelves producing seismic waves that propagated through the water with remarkable efficiency. Yet despite this rational explanation, despite the publication of peer-reviewed papers and the confident proclamations of marine biologists, the mystery has somehow persisted in popular culture and in the darker corners of the internet, where people continue to speculate about unknown ocean creatures and to treat the bloop as evidence of something science cannot explain, something that science has explained away perhaps too conveniently, perhaps to avoid the unsettling implication that we share this planet with mysteries we cannot yet comprehend. And perhaps that reluctance to accept mystery, that compulsion to resolve uncertainty with rational explanation, reveals something equally profound about human nature itself, our need to believe that the world, for all its vastness and strangeness, ultimately conforms to patterns we can understand and control, that there are no true unknowns, only phenomena awaiting discovery and categorization into the neat taxonomies of science. Yet the bloop endures as a cultural artifact precisely because it exists in that liminal space between explanation and mystery, a reminder that even in an age of unprecedented scientific advancement, the ocean still guards its secrets, and the universe remains far stranger and more vast than our instruments, or our imagination, have yet fully grasped. Perhaps this is why the bloop continues to surface in documentaries and late-night discussions decades later, not because the scientific explanation was inadequate, but because it serves as a humbling reminder that our mastery of the natural world remains incomplete, and that in the vastness of the deep ocean, wonder and mystery are not flaws in our understanding, but rather essential features of a universe that will always exceed the boundaries of human knowledge. The bloop thus stands alongside other great oceanic mysteries: the existence of the giant squid, unconfirmed for centuries until specimens were finally recovered, or the ongoing discovery of entirely new species in the abyssal depths, as testament to the humbling truth that the ocean's inventory remains incomplete, and that science progresses not through the elimination of mystery, but through the patient, iterative process of transforming the unknown into the merely difficult to understand. In this way, the bloop represents not a failure of science, but rather its greatest strength, the acknowledgement that whys exist to be solved, and that the pursuit of understanding, however gradual and however humbling, remains the most noble endeavor available to a curious species inhabiting an endless. Imagine standing in front of a vast instrument panel with countless dials, each one controlling a fundamental property of the universe, and every single dial must be set to an incomprehensibly precise value for anything to exist at all, a phenomenon that physicists call the fine-tuning problem, which reveals itself most starkly when we examine the fundamental constants of nature, those supposedly fixed numbers that govern how gravity operates. How strong the electromagnetic force is, how nuclei hold together, and the energy density of empty space itself. The peculiarity emerges when cosmologists and physicists calculate what these values need to be for stars to form, for planets to exist, for chemistry to work, for life to be even remotely possible, and they discover that if any of these constants varied by even a tiny fraction of a percent, the universe would be fundamentally different and utterly hostile to existence as we know it. The gravitational constant, for instance, appears fine-tuned to such a degree that if it were slightly stronger, all stars would burn out in mere millions of years instead of billions, leaving insufficient time for life to evolve, while if it were slightly weaker, stars would never ignite at all, and the universe would remain a cold, dark void of dispersed matter. The cosmological constant controlling the expansion rate of space itself seems tuned to better than 1 part in 120 orders of magnitude, a precision so staggering that it defies intuitive comprehension and seems almost impossible to attribute to chance alone. The psychological mechanism underlying our engagement with this problem stems from our deep-seated pattern recognition abilities and our tendency to see intentionality and design where precise conditions exist. Because our brains evolved in an environment where noticing patterns and inferring purpose from careful arrangements was often adaptive and useful for survival. When we encounter something as improbable as the fine-tuning of the universe, we instinctively suspect that someone or something deliberately arranged these dials, that there must be purposeful design behind such exquisite precision. And this intuition feels so compelling that it has influenced theological and philosophical thinking for centuries. The logical difficulty arises because we lack any scientific framework for explaining why these constants should have any particular value rather than another. No underlying theory that predicts they must be precisely what they are, and no obvious reason why the universe should be calibrated so delicately for complexity and life to emerge. Some physicists invoke the multiverse hypothesis, suggesting that infinite universes exist with different constants, and we naturally find ourselves in one where the constants permit observers, a concept called anthropic selection. Yet this merely pushes the question back one level by asking why a multiverse should exist at all, and why it should contain infinite universes with varying constants. What persists despite the lack of satisfying logical resolution is our simultaneous acceptance of both the mystery and our continued operation, as though it isn't truly mysterious, as though the universe simply happens to work this way, and we should focus on understanding the mechanisms rather than pondering why those mechanisms exist at all. We have normalized this profound improbability, tucking it away into graduate-level physics seminars and philosophical discussions, while continuing our daily lives with the implicit assumption that constants are constant for good reasons that science will eventually explain. even though centuries of scientific progress have never actually resolved the fundamental question of why these numbers are what they are. The fine-tuning problem remains embedded in the very foundation of cosmology, a perpetual reminder that beneath our elaborate scientific understanding lies an irreducible fact that may or may not have an explanation, and we persist in studying the universe while accepting this strange, unresolvable tension between improbability and existence as simply the way things happen to be. Perhaps this acceptance itself reveals something profound, that our capacity to live meaningfully within unresolved cosmic mysteries, to build knowledge and pursue understanding without requiring ultimate answers, may be not a failure of human cognition, but rather its greatest achievement, a reconciliation between our hunger for explanation and our willingness to act despite uncertainty. We see this same pattern reflected in how we approach other cosmic mysteries: dark matter, dark energy, the origin of the laws of physics themselves, where we acknowledge the profound questions while simultaneously constructing increasingly sophisticated models to describe what we observe, suggesting that perhaps the deepest human wisdom lies not in resolving these mysteries, but in developing the intellectual maturity to live productively within them, to ask better questions rather than demand final answers. Imagine standing in the middle of a conversation when suddenly you become aware that you are about to remember something important, something you absolutely know exists in your mind somewhere just beyond the surface of consciousness. Yet the harder you reach for it, the faster it seems to recede into the shadows of your memory. This peculiar state is called presque, a French term meaning almost seen, and it represents perhaps one of the most maddening inversions of the tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon that human consciousness can experience. Where tip of the tongue involves knowing you have forgotten something, presque involves the unsettling certainty that you are on the verge of a profound realization or recollection that simply will not materialize despite your desperate mental efforts to grasp it. You might find yourself in this state while reading a passage in a book and suddenly feel convinced that you understand what the author is about to say before you actually read it. Or perhaps you are having a discussion with a friend when a familiar concept arrives at the edges of your awareness, yet you cannot quite bring it into focus no matter how much you concentrate. The experience carries with it a peculiar burden because it creates an expectation in the mind, a sense that meaning or knowledge is hovering just beyond perception, that if you could only think about it from the right angle or approach it from a different direction, the revelation would finally crystallize into conscious awareness. This mechanism appears to emerge from the brain's predictive nature, the way your neural systems are constantly generating expectations about what should come next based on patterns and prior experiences stored throughout your lifetime of accumulated knowledge and sensation. When these predictive systems activate without being fully satisfied by conscious access to the information they are predicting, the result is this strange half-state of almost knowing, where your mind feels the presence of something without being able to access its actual content. The phenomenon suggests that consciousness itself may operate on multiple levels simultaneously, with some systems detecting and processing information that never fully reaches the surface of awareness, creating a ghostly sense of presence without substance. What makes presque particularly difficult to rationalize is that we cannot dismiss it as mere imagination, because the feeling of knowing something is entirely authentic and compelling, yet it remains perpetually unfulfilled. We have normalized this strange glitch by simply accepting it as part of the mysterious workings of human memory and perception, understanding that our minds are imperfect instruments that sometimes detect signals we cannot fully interpret, and yet this explanation provides little comfort when you find yourself caught in that maddening gap between the certainty of knowledge and the inability to access it, suspended in a liminal space where your consciousness knows something that your consciousness cannot know. Perhaps this is why presque haunts us more than simple forgetting. It whispers that our minds contain depths we cannot fully access, that consciousness is not the unified, transparent phenomenon we imagine it to be, but rather a fragmented theater where some players remain forever hidden behind the curtain, their presence felt but their words forever unspoken. In this way, presque becomes a kind of philosophical mirror held up to consciousness itself, revealing that the act of remembering is not simply retrieval, but a complex negotiation between what we know and what we can express, between the vast archives of our experience and the narrow bandwidth of awareness that allows us to speak about what we know. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that these hidden depths may contain not forgotten knowledge, but genuine insights our minds have generated without our permission, thoughts we have already thought but cannot yet think again. This possibility suggests that Presque might not be a failure of memory at all, but rather evidence that consciousness is constantly generating new understanding in regions we cannot access, and that the feeling of almost knowing is simply our awareness brushing against the edges of thoughts we have not yet permitted ourselves to think. The experience thus becomes less a frustration and more an invitation to acknowledge the profound strangeness of being a mind aware of its own limitations. In moments when we stop struggling against Presque and instead allow ourselves to sit with the discomfort of incomplete knowing, we might discover that the experience itself, that tantalizing nearness without arrival, holds a strange wisdom about the human condition, teaching us that some of our most valuable insights emerge not from certainty, but from the fertile space between forgetting and remembering, where meaning is still taking shape. In this liminal pace, we learn to trust the whisper more than the shout, understanding that consciousness often communicates through absence and near presence rather than clarity. Consider the strange phenomenon of time dilation, wherein the fundamental passage of moments themselves appears to bend and warp depending on the observer's relationship to velocity and gravitational fields, creating a glitch in the seemingly universal fabric of temporal experience that science has identified but cannot truly reconcile with our everyday perception of reality. Einstein's theory of relativity revealed that time is not the immutable constant that classical physics had assumed for centuries, but rather a malleable dimension that stretches and compresses based on measurable physical conditions. And while we have developed precise mathematical frameworks to predict these effects with extraordinary accuracy, the actual lived experience of time passing at different rates for different observers remains profoundly disorienting to contemplate. Imagine a spacecraft traveling at near-light speed hurtling through the vacuum of space while you remain stationary on Earth, and the astronaut aboard that vessel would age more slowly than you would, their biological clock literally ticking at a different rate, their heart beating fewer times, their cells dividing less frequently, all because they are moving through space at velocity relative to your frame of reference. And this is not metaphorical or theoretical, but an actual measurable difference in the aging process between two human beings. The psychological mechanism that allows us to accept this reality, despite its fundamental counterintuitiveness, lies partly in the fact that time dilation effects only become significant at velocities and gravitational intensities far beyond our normal experience. So our brains have never evolved to intuitively grasp situations where these effects would be noticeable. And therefore we can intellectually acknowledge that time dilation is real without ever feeling the cognitive dissonance that might arise if we regularly encountered its effects. We have normalized this glitch in reality by compartmentalizing it as a phenomenon that exists in the realm of theoretical physics and extreme cosmic environments, rather than integrating it into our fundamental understanding of how the universe works at every scale, allowing us to maintain our classical intuitions about time flowing uniformly while simultaneously accepting that this intuition is demonstrably false in certain contexts. And this strange duality persists even though it represents a profound contradiction in our model of reality that we simply choose not to dwell upon in our daily lives. Yet this willful compartmentalization becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as our technology advances, and we begin to rely on systems like GPS satellites, whose atomic clocks must be continuously adjusted to account for time dilation effects, revealing that we have unwittingly built a civilization dependent on accepting and compensating for a phenomenon we still find philosophically troubling. Effectively outsourcing our reconciliation with relativity to the machines that mediate our navigation through both space and the conceptual landscape of modern physics. And perhaps this is the ultimate irony, that we have achieved technological mastery over a phenomenon we refuse to fully comprehend, delegating our understanding to equations and algorithms while the philosophical implications, that time itself is not the universal constant binding all observers together, but rather a personal experience shaped by motion and gravity, remain largely unexamined in the collective consciousness, a truth we use without truly accepting. Perhaps it is only when we finally venture beyond Earth in significant numbers, when time dilation becomes not an abstract concern of physicists, but a lived reality for space travelers separated from their loved ones by relativistic time gaps that cannot be bridged, that we will be forced to truly internalize what Einstein revealed, that the universe does not care about our intuitions, and time belongs to no one equally. Until that moment arrives, we remain suspended in a peculiar state of intellectual acceptance and emotional denial, knowing that time moves differently for a GPS satellite orbiting Earth than for the person holding the phone it powers, yet feeling no visceral connection to this knowledge, as if the universe has granted us permission to believe in relativity only as long as we never truly feel it in our bones. And so we continue our existence in this peculiar limbo, checking our phones for directions guided by satellites experiencing time at a fractionally different rate than we do, never pausing to consider the philosophical weight of that dependency, content to let physics operate invisibly in the infrastructure of our lives, while we reserve our wonder for more immediately comprehensible mysteries. Perhaps this is why the astronauts aboard the International Space Station, aging infinitesimally slower than those of us on Earth's surface, experience air temporal privilege in complete silence, never remarking on the strange gift of extra microseconds of life that relativity has bestowed upon them, a benefit so small it remains. Consider the moment when you find yourself unable to locate a memory in time, when you cannot answer with certainty whether an event occurred 3 months ago or 3 years ago, when the distance between now and then becomes impossibly blurred and you're left grasping at contextual clues to reconstruct the temporal position of your own experiences. This is Chronesthesia failure, the breakdown of your brain's capacity to automatically tag memories with their position in the timeline of your life, leaving you with vivid recollections that feel untethered from any meaningful date or duration. You remember exactly what happened, every detail crystalline and accessible, yet the when remains stubbornly opaque, forcing you to count backwards through seasons and jobs and relationships just to place it somewhere along your personal history. The mechanism behind this phenomenon involves the medial temporal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, neural regions responsible for encoding not just the content of memories, but their temporal context, the neural timestamp that tells you whether something belongs to last week or last decade. When these systems fail, or when the neural pathways connecting memory content to temporal information degrade, you experience a profound disorientation despite perfect recall of the event itself. A strange and unsettling cognitive glitch where knowing what happened provides no insight into when it happened. Yet we persist in accepting this as simply how memory works sometimes, acknowledging it with phrases like "my sense of time is terrible" or "I'm bad with dates," as though it's merely a minor personality quirk rather than a genuine failure of a supposedly fundamental cognitive system that should automatically organize our lived experience into a coherent timeline. We normalize the idea that we might have major gaps in our ability to situate ourselves temporally, that we can remember everything, but forget nothing yet still be unable to answer the most basic question about our own pasts. And we move forward without genuine alarm, despite the existential strangeness of living with memories that float untethered through your personal history like events happening to someone else in some unmappable version of time. The accumulation of these untethered memories creates a strange archaeology of self, where you might reconstruct your life not as a continuous narrative, but as a series of disconnected tableaus. Vivid scenes arranged in uncertain order, their sequence knowable only through painstaking detective work involving external anchors like photographs, social media timestamps, or the corroborating memories of others who were there to place events in a shared timeline you yourself cannot access. And in those moments when you must ask a friend, "Wait, when was that?" to locate your own memory in time, you confront the possibility that the narrative self you've constructed, the sense of continuous identity threading through years, might be more fragile and dependent on external scaffolding than you'd prefer to believe, held together less by your brain's reliable timestamping and more by the accumulated corroboration of other people's timelines pressing against your own. This dependency on external validation for something as fundamental as temporal autobiography suggests that identity itself might be less a property of individual memory and more a collaborative construction, one that dissolves the moment you're alone with your own recollections and no one else is there to confirm that, yes, this happened then, and that's what makes you you. Which is perhaps why solitude feels so destabilizing, not because you're alone with your thoughts, but because you're alone with memories that refuse to arrange themselves into a coherent story without an audience to witness and timestamp them, leaving you suspended in a perpetual present where your past exists only in fragments, waiting for someone else to help you remember when you lived it. And so you develop a strange habit of anchoring yourself to other people's timelines, asking not, "When did this happen to me?" but "Where were you when I experienced this?" as if their presence at the event, their corroborating memory, could retroactively restore the temporal coordinates your own mind failed to preserve, turning what should be your solitary recollection into a shared artifact that only gains temporal substance when held up against another person's version of when it occurred. Because in asking them to anchor you, you're not just retrieving a date, you're asking them to confirm that you existed at a particular moment in their world, that your experience was real enough to leave an impression on someone else's timeline. And without that external corroboration, the memory threatens to dissolve into the amorphous blur of some time, untethered and therefore almost unreal. This is why photographs become totems, not because they preserve images, but because they preserve when that your own mind discarded, transforming a floating memory back into a locatable event, restoring it to the timeline where you can finally say with certainty, I wa. Imagine the universe at the very end of time, when all stars have burned out, all black holes have evaporated, and nothing but a cold, empty void stretches infinitely in every direction for trillions upon trillions of years into the future. In this incomprehensibly distant epoch, the laws of thermodynamics and quantum mechanics continue their eternal work, occasionally producing random fluctuations in the fabric of spacetime itself. According to the calculations of physicist Ludwig Boltzmann in the 19th century, and later refined by modern cosmologists, these random quantum fluctuations would eventually, through pure chance and given enough time, spontaneously assemble the precise atomic and molecular configurations necessary to create a conscious brain. Not a body, not a universe, but just a brain floating alone in the void, complete with memories and sensations, experiencing a moment of consciousness before dissolving back into entropy. This is the Boltzmann brain, and it represents one of the most unsettling logical implications of modern physics and our understanding of probability across cosmic timescales. The mechanism behind this phenomenon rests on a simple but disturbing principle. Given an infinite universe and infinite time, every possible arrangement of matter that can exist will eventually exist, simply through random chance and statistical probability. A conscious brain requires far fewer atoms to be arranged in the correct configuration than an entire universe with stars and planets and observers embedded within it. Therefore, in the infinite future, Boltzmann brains should vastly outnumber conscious observers like ourselves who evolved naturally within structured universes. This creates a profound logical paradox, because if we accept the mathematics, we should statistically expect that we ourselves are Boltzmann brains, experiencing a false memory of having evolved in a universe with history and structure, when in fact we are isolated conscious moments arising from quantum fluctuations in an otherwise dead cosmos. This thought destabilizes our confidence in our own existence and the reality of our perceived past. The persistence of this concept in serious cosmological discussion, despite its deeply counterintuitive and philosophically troubling nature, reveals how modern physics has forced us to accept conclusions that transcend our intuitive understanding of reality. We have not resolved the Boltzmann brain problem because we cannot easily dismiss it without abandoning well-established physical principles. Yet we also cannot fully accept it without destabilizing our sense of epistemic security and our confidence that our memories and perceptions reflect an actual historical reality rather than a momentary hallucination of consciousness arising in an empty universe. Some physicists have proposed solutions. Perhaps the universe is not infinite, or perhaps the arrow of time itself prevents such fluctuations from occurring in reverse. But these resolutions remain speculative and unsatisfying, leaving us to grapple with a universe that may be fundamentally indifferent to our desperate need for certainty about the nature of our own consciousness. The irony is that we cannot even use our reasoning faculties to escape this trap, for if we are Boltzmann brains, then our logic itself is merely the firing of neurons assembled by chance, no more reliable than a random fluctuation masquerading as thought. In this way, the Boltzmann brain transforms from a mere cosmological curiosity into a kind of epistemic vertigo that strikes at the very foundation of how we claim to know anything at all. Yet this vertigo may itself be a gift, for it forces us to confront the possibility that our most cherished assumptions about causality, memory, and identity are not immutable truths, but rather provisional frameworks we construct to navigate an ultimately unknowable reality. And in doing so, we glimpse the humbling realization that consciousness itself may be far stranger and more contingent than we ever dared imagine. Perhaps this is why contemplating Boltzmann brains feels less like solving a physics problem and more like staring into an abyss that stares back. We are forced to recognize that the question, what is real, may not have the reassuring answer we seek, only the unsettling acknowledgement that consciousness itself may be the universe's way of experiencing its own fundamental uncertainty. And yet, perhaps this is precisely the point. A universe capable of generating conscious experience through pure chance, whether embedded in evolutionary history or emerging spontaneously in the void, suggests that consciousness itself may be a more fundamental and resilient feature of reality than we typically assume, woven into the very fabric of existence in ways we have yet to comprehend. If we accept that consciousness might arise anywhere given sufficient time and the right quantum fluctuations, then perhaps emergence of minds like ours becomes less a miraculous accident and more an inevitable consequence of a universe governed by laws that inexorably generate awareness wherever Consider the peculiar situation that emerges whenever we attempt to measure something with precision, a phenomenon so fundamental to our understanding of reality that we rarely pause to examine its logical foundation. When a physicist or engineer measures the temperature of water, the length of a table, the weight of an object, or the speed of a moving vehicle, they introduce an instrument into the system being measured, and that instrument necessarily interacts with what it measures, however minutely, changing the very property being observed in the process. This is not merely a limitation of our current technology or a problem that future instruments might solve, but rather an inherent feature of how measurement itself functions at every scale of existence. The act of observation requires interaction, and interaction requires exchange of energy or information, which means that the measured system is always slightly different after measurement than it was before measurement occurred. Yet we persist in treating measurements as though they capture some pristine, pre-existing truth about reality, as though the universe contains fixed values simply waiting to be discovered rather than values that are partially created by the act of discovery itself. In quantum mechanics, this principle becomes mathematically unavoidable, a fundamental law written into the equations themselves, yet even in classical physics at the scales we experience daily, the same principle applies, merely at magnitudes we find convenient to ignore. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we build entire civilizations upon measurements, while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge that every measurement is an act of interference masquerading as an act of observation. A thermometer inserted into water absorbs heat from or conducts heat to the water, altering its temperature. A ruler placed against an object must make contact, applying pressure that could theoretically compress or deform the object being measured. A scale requires the object to rest upon it, subjecting it to the gravitational and frictional forces of the measurement apparatus itself. We accept calibration standards and uncertainty ranges as though they solve this problem, yet they merely quantify how much we have changed things without telling us what the thing actually was before we looked. The measurement problem persists not because science lacks better instruments, but because reality appears to resist the very possibility of objective observation, and we have chosen to ignore this resistance rather than confront what it might mean. Perhaps the deepest irony is that we have constructed our most precise instruments, particle accelerators, spectroscopes, atomic clocks, not to bypass this problem but to quantify it more accurately, creating an elaborate mathematics of ignorance that measures the unmeasurable with ever-increasing confidence, while the fundamental question remains unanswered. What exists in the spaces between our observations? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that there is nothing in those spaces, that reality itself is fundamentally incomplete until observed, a universe of potentialities rather than actualities, which would mean that measurement does not merely disturb an existing state, but actively participates in collapsing infinite possibilities into the singular fact we call a measurement, transforming the question from "what did we miss?" into the far more troubling "what did we create?" If this interpretation is correct, then the scientist holding a measuring instrument is not a neutral recorder of nature, but an active participant in its manifestation, which would fundamentally reframe the relationship between observer and observed, not as subject studying object, but as co-creator engaged in an ongoing dialogue with reality itself, where each measurement is less a discovery of what was and more a negotiation of what will be. This reframing dissolves the comfortable boundary between physics and philosophy, suggesting that the act of measurement is not a technical problem awaiting a technical solution, but rather a fundamental feature of existence itself, one that demands we reconsider whether objectivity is even a coherent concept, or whether it has always been a convenient fiction we maintain to avoid confronting our own inextricable entanglement with the world we inhabit. Yet if we accept this entanglement as foundational rather than aberrant, we might begin to ask not how to eliminate the observer's influence, but how to understand measurement as a form of conversation between consciousness and cosmos, a dialogue in which both parties are transformed by their encounter, and in which the very notion of objective truth gives way to something far more subtle. The recognition that reality is not a fixed stage upon which observation occurs, but rather an emergent property of the observation itself. In this view, the physicist measure. In quantum spin and the parent weighing their newborn child are engaged in fundamentally identical acts, both calling something into being through the act of attending to it. Imagine a particle trapped behind a barrier so imposing that classical physics declares it impossible for that particle to ever cross to the other side, and yet in laboratories around the world, scientists observe with perfect regularity that particles do cross these barriers anyway, passing through solid obstacles as though they were merely suggestions rather than physical laws. And this phenomenon known as quantum tunneling represents one of the most fundamentally unsettling violations of our intuitive understanding of how reality should function at the smallest scales. When a particle encounters an energy barrier that it theoretically lacks the energy to overcome, conventional physics dictates that it should simply bounce back, confined forever on its original side, unable to access the forbidden territory beyond. Yet quantum mechanics reveals that particles possess a kind of probabilistic ghostliness that allows them to manifest on the other side of the barrier with measurable frequency. Not through any physical passage or breach, but through a sheer violation of the deterministic causality that governs our macroscopic experience. This occurs because at quantum scales, particles do not exist as precise point objects with definite locations, but rather as probability waves that extend through space in a blur of potential positions. And these probability waves do not terminate abruptly at a barrier, but instead decay gradually and fade into the regions beyond. Meaning there is always a non-zero probability of finding a particle on the far side of an obstacle, even when it lacks sufficient energy to classically surmount it. And this probability, though exponentially small, produces observable results in phenomena ranging from radioactive decay, where alpha particles escape atomic nuclei, to tunneling microscopes that exploit this effect to image individual atoms with extraordinary precision. The psychological mechanism that allows scientists to accept this phenomenon without descending into complete conceptual chaos lies in a kind of mathematical surrender, a willingness to abandon the demand that reality match our intuitions, and instead to accept whatever the equations predict as simply the way things are. And quantum mechanics has proven so devastatingly successful at prediction and application that physicists have largely stopped asking why tunneling occurs, and instead ask only how to calculate its probability and how to harness it for technological advantage. Yet this normalization of the inexplicable has created a strange situation where one of the most profound violations of common sense is discussed in academic circles with the same casual confidence as one might discuss gravity or magnetism. We have collectively agreed that tunneling is real, measurable, reproducible, and absolutely essential to the functioning of the universe as we understand it. And yet no one can provide a satisfying explanation for how a particle actually gets from one side of a barrier to the other, whether it passes through some hidden dimension, whether it flickers in and out of existence momentarily, or whether such questions are fundamentally misguided because they assume a classical continuity of motion that does not apply in the quantum realm, and this unresolved paradox persists not because science has failed to solve it, but because the problem may be insoluble within the framework of questions we are permitted to ask by the very mathematical formalism that describes it so perfectly. Yet perhaps this acceptance of mystery is itself the deeper lesson. That reality at its most fundamental level operates according to principles that resist the narrative explanations our brains evolved to construct, and that the measure of scientific maturity is not the elimination of bewilderment, but rather the development of sophisticated mathematical languages precise enough to predict phenomena we cannot visualize or intuitively comprehend. In this sense, quantum tunneling stands as a monument to the limits of human intuition, a phenomenon we can predict with extraordinary precision while remaining fundamentally unable to visualize or explain in the language of cause and effect, reminding us that the universe under no obligation to be comprehensible to minds that evolved to navigate a world of medium-sized objects moving at moderate speeds. And yet this very incomprehensibility has become generative. Quantum tunneling underpins technologies from semiconductors to nuclear fusion, suggesting that nature rewards those willing to work with mathematical descriptions rather than insisting on mechanical explanations. And perhaps the deepest insight is not that tunneling violates our intuitions, but that our intuitions were always merely provincial, useful guides for navigating a narrow slice of reality, but never meant to govern the entire cosmos. The same humility that allows us to accept tunneling's mystery may be our best preparation for whatever oath. Profound revelations await us as we continue probing the quantum realm's deepest secrets. Consider the peculiar situation where physicists have identified that even at absolute zero temperature, where theoretically all motion should cease and all energy should dissipate completely, quantum fields continue to exhibit motion and energy fluctuations that refuse to disappear, creating what we call zero-point energy or the quantum vacuum energy. A phenomenon that represents perhaps one of the most unsettling contradictions in our understanding of reality, because it suggests that truly empty space is not actually empty at all, but rather seethes with virtual particles constantly popping in and out of existence at scales so infinitesimal that we can barely measure them, yet their effects ripple through the entire cosmos like whispers from a reality beneath reality. The psychological mechanism that allows this glitch to persist in our collective scientific consciousness operates on several levels simultaneously, beginning with the fact that zero-point energy exists at a scale so removed from human perception that our brains struggle to process it as anything more than an abstract mathematical construct rather than something genuinely real and tangible. Much like how we can intellectually understand that atoms are mostly empty space, yet continue to experience matter as fundamentally solid and impenetrable. Furthermore, the very act of observing or measuring zero-point energy fundamentally alters it through quantum mechanical principles, creating a circular logical problem where we cannot definitively prove the nature of something without changing it through the act of observation itself, which generates a kind of intellectual permission structure allowing scientists to theorize about zero-point energy, while simultaneously acknowledging that we may never truly understand what it is or how it functions at any level deeper than mathematical description. There exists also a peculiar economic and philosophical motivation behind the continued research into zero-point energy, because the theoretical possibility that unlimited clean energy might be extractable from the quantum vacuum has become almost mythologized in certain scientific and technological circles, creating a kind of hope-driven persistence that allows research to continue despite the absence of any practical application or even any consensus on whether extraction would theoretically be possible, suggesting that we have normalized a state of investigating something that may not be investigable while holding on to the dream that it might solve our energy crisis. The glitch deepens when we acknowledge that the calculations surrounding zero-point energy have led to predictions that conflict with observations at cosmological scales, such as when we try to account for dark energy and the accelerating expansion of the universe. The predicted energy density of the quantum vacuum proves to be off by factors so astronomical, sometimes described as wrong by 120 orders of magnitude, creating what physicists call the worst prediction in the history of science. Yet we continue to accept the existence of zero-point energy because the mathematics that describes it has proven useful in other contexts, and because the alternative explanations seem equally mysterious. We have become comfortable with a situation where we affirm the existence of an invisible, unmeasurable, largely theoretical form of energy that we cannot access, cannot fully explain, and whose properties may be fundamentally inaccessible to human investigation, yet we treat it as established fact rather than speculation, allowing it to persist in our scientific understanding as a kind of perpetual anomaly that we have simply learned to live alongside. This acceptance mirrors how we have similarly internalized other profound unknowns: dark matter, quantum entanglement, the nature of time itself, suggesting that modern physics may have fundamentally shifted from seeking complete understanding to instead constructing increasingly sophisticated frameworks for navigating mysteries we have tacitly agreed to stop trying to fully resolve, transforming science from a quest for certainty into a pragmatic management of productive uncertainty. Perhaps nowhere is this shift more apparent than in how we have collectively decided that zero-point energy deserves a place in our scientific canon, not because we have solved it, but precisely because we have learned to productively coexist with its unsolvability, transforming what might have been recognized as a fundamental crisis in physics into instead a kind of intellectual humility. A tacit acknowledgement that the universe may contain layers of reality whose nature is not merely unknown but potentially unknowable, and that this incompleteness need not undermine the entire edifice of scientific knowledge, but rather can be woven into its very foundation as an honest accounting of consciousness, encountering a cosmos far stranger than our frameworks were ever designed to contain.